Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting. It is Thursday, January 19th, and it looks like we have a quorum present. So the first item on our agenda is to approve the agenda. Are there any additions, deletions? Mr. Carpenter?
Thank you. I'd like to ask if the board is okay deleting item 2.3. It's not actually an action item. It was sort of a clerical error that is here. All board members have signed their disclosure statements. There's really no action for the board to take.
I'm okay with that. Do we need to make a motion for the board to accept that? No? Okay. Are we all in agreement then, just like casually? All right. All right, we'll make that so. Next on our agenda is public comment. Deb, do we have any? Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. We need to make a motion to approve the agenda. Thank you, Richard. And does anybody want to make a motion?
Motion.
Motion by Ryan, seconded by Jesse. All in favor, say aye or raise your hand. Very good. It passed unanimously. Thank you so much. And now we're on to public comment. Deb, do we have anybody in the wings there?
We do, Robert Pulowski, and he is unmuted now.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Pulowski. I represent the Regional Transit Authority Citizens Advisory Committee. First thing, and I wasn't able to make this last meeting back in December to make some of these statements, but first thing I'd like to say, well, Happy New Year. And we have a lot ahead of us. We had some major projects that we wrapped up and a lot of public engagement that was made. One of the things that we had successfully passed in the 2022 primary election was the millage for the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority. Major support from all the communities, especially from the Ann Arbor City Council and Ypsi City Council. We had a lot of public feedback from our libraries and Briarwood Mall, from local businesses here in Ann Arbor and Ypsi, and a lot of people are for transit, and we're starting to see that. But also, most importantly, our 2045 study that was really conducted, that has really changed the game here in Ann Arbor, but also really changes our vision of transit here in this state. But most of all, our propulsion study that has really taken hit with our new vehicles that are going to be somewhat being examined here in the system and will hopefully be on the streets of Ann Arbor and Ypsi in the near future. But one of the things that really catches my mind, and you guys are one of the leading agencies, is you're paying almost $28 an hour for drivers, and you have a very good record of retaining drivers. A lot of drivers are very interested in Ann Arbor. There are a lot of perks. They have a really good union, and we see a lot of changes. So Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority has really changed the game in terms of what we've seen from January of 2022 to January of 2023. And this year is very hopeful now, since we have a full support of transit, especially in Oakland County now, since that Swiss cheese has been lifted off. We have a lot of good projects coming our way, and we have a lot of good things coming, but also to send my best wishes and remarks to former board member Eric Mahler. He has done wonderful things for the system. And I know he's possibly in this call somewhere, but he has done a lot of good things. We have accomplished a lot of projects, especially on this board, and look forward to the best, and especially going into 2023 with great hopes and expanding transit all over countywide. But as always, thank you, and look forward to talking with you guys soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pulowski. Deb, is there anyone else online?
There is no one else.
All right, well, seeing no one in the audience, we will go ahead and close public comment and move on to 1.3, general announcements. Are there any general announcements available tonight? Yes, go ahead, Jesse.
I just wanted to announce, I think most of us are aware that TheRide received a $7 million appropriation from the federal government, thanks to the efforts of Debbie Dingell and our senators. I had the fortune of meeting with Representative Dingell and also the mayor of Ypsilanti, Nicole Brown. I'm sorry, the appropriation for the YTC. This is $7 million towards the construction of a new Ypsilanti Transit Center. It was great to meet Representative Dingell. She asked a lot of really fantastic, in-depth questions. She's obviously very invested in this project. I think she saw from the, I think she sees this as very valuable to the community, as does Mayor Brown. I think that whole area where the transit center is located is really looking at a lot of new development. There's going to be a health center going in there, and I really see that this new transit center is coming at just the right time. So, yeah, again, many thanks to Representative Dingle for ushering this through. It's kind of changed the entire face of this project as far as I'm concerned.
That's wonderful news, and also we probably would like to thank all the staff who worked so hard getting those grants in for that earmark. Are there any other announcements? That's going to be a hard one to follow up. Yes, Mr. Carpenter.
An impossible act to follow. A quick announcement, just want to make sure board members and the general public are aware. Deb Holt sent an email around about a small trade show / conference opportunity for transit in early February in Detroit. It is free, which is nice. Bus World, if you have a chance, check Deb's email. Have a look at the program. There are several items on there about zero emissions or low emissions propulsion technology. Some of you might be interested in that. I think there might be some equity matters on there as well. There's also going to be a small trade show. So if you want to see, buses on display, that might be a place to do it. I will warn you, it does appear to be maybe 75% geared towards the over-the-road highway coach industry, so that's the tour operators and the private bus operators, but there does seem to be a mixture of public transit in there as well. So just wanted to reiterate that opportunity is out there. It's free and just 45 minutes up the road, so it's a good education opportunity.
Excellent, thank you for that. Any other announcements? Seeing none, we'll go on ahead and move on to the consent agenda. Number 2, is everyone all right with the consent agenda? Do we need to pull anything out, or are we ready to make a motion to approve the consent agenda? Yes, Ryan?
Seeing none, I will consent to the consent agenda.
You're making a motion?
Yes.
Do I have a second? Simi? And all in favor, please say aye or raise your hand. Wonderful, that passed unanimously. Thank you so much, everyone. So now we're moving quickly into policy monitoring and development, and our first item on the agenda is our annual plan of work. The governance committee did work on the suggestions that were made back in December by the board at our last board meeting. It is in your packet. It is on page 3, I think is what it says. No, wrong. 18. Forgive me. So page 18 of your packet. It actually on page 20 is where the items are listed in a thorough manner. And the current work plan, we've maintained, we have the ends review, which is an annual task. We're in progress for our propulsion. We are working on an advocacy agenda. We have tentatively scheduled March as the retreat discussion for equity. We have added sustainability, post-pandemic trends, and policy development education with our policy governance coach, Rose Mercier. Underneath are other possible subject for topics that I believe, for myself, the first 7 is a really hardy, large amount of work for 1 year. And so it is my hope that we can come to a consensus that about what is on here, and someone might make a motion to move forward that what is on this packet page is meeting our needs, and we can move forward and book the rest of our year. Does anybody have any discussion around this? Yes, go ahead, Richard.
So, I mean, I'm a big fan of the topics we have here. I guess the question I had is, like, what exactly does in progress mean? So, for instance, like, we have propulsion, and we talked about that in our last kind of big trainings. I mean, that future board meetings will actually slot out time to discuss, or?
It's my understanding that because we've begun the process and we already have these targeted dates, like I believe in February, we're going to be hearing about ZEBs from Mr. Carpenter and things like that. So in other words, it's in progress. We're already doing that work versus let's say, sustainability, we haven't set a date or attached a label to that yet, so it's to be determined for a future date, or how do we, do it in a board meeting, or do we do it in a retreat sort of situation? But do I have that right, Mr. Carpenter, that that is what the thought is behind that process? Okay, so that was a good question. Does anybody else have any questions? If we're feeling comfortable with what is on this plan, I would like someone to make a motion to put this into the record, that this will be our annual plan of work for fiscal year. Well, it looks like the fiscal year is incorrect on this. It's not 2021, it would be 2023.
I move to accept the board's plan of work for fiscal year 2023.
All right.
Support.
And supported by Ryan. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Wonderful. It looks like it passed unanimously. That was a nice piece of work. Good job, guys. So now we're on to 3.2, the task force updates. And the first update is 3.2.1, ownership linkage by Mr. Chang.
Sure, just have a quick update on that. So we've actually been combining the ownership linkage task force meetings with the services committee meeting, which actually has proved very efficient and helpful, concerning most of the task force members are part of service committee. In the last meeting, we just really finalized who exactly are the legal owners that we're going to tackle. And then the next step that we have is we just have a draft letter that we're assembling that I will send out once the task force has had a chance to get their input in to the different committees to get your eyes and feedback on it. Because the purpose of this particular letter, it'll be going to basically the supervisors and the township, oh my gosh, I'm a total brain fart, the city administrator, to get in front of them. And then from there, it'll help us to figure out a plan of approach as to who they think we should chat with and a timeline that we can do. So that's it.
Excellent. Does anybody have any questions for Rich? Thank you for all your hard work on that. We really appreciate it. Next in line is 3.2.2, monitoring, and that is Mr. Mike Alamang, who is with us virtually.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to go over a little bit of history because we've discussed this at various times, and particularly I'd like to summarize what the board did at the last 3 board meetings, just to kind of put everything in perspective for tonight. At the October board, we approved the new way that the board takes the survey, which we call a survey tool. And basically it focuses on, it's because you've already used it, you probably remember, but it focuses on interpretation of the policies and the evidence that demonstrates compliance. However, at that time, the task force hadn't developed a recommendation on how to vote at the board meetings consistent with this new way that they fill out the survey. So then at the November board meeting, we presented our initial thoughts about how the voting would go consistent with that new survey. A would be everything is okay on both interpretation and compliance. B would be certain items that don't have reasonable interpretation. And C, that the interpretations were okay, but evidence of certain items doesn't show compliance. We didn't ask for board approval at that time. It's the first time the board has seen this. Also, the task force really wanted to meet again to go over the proposal and see if that's exactly what we wanted to bring to the board to their vote. In December, Kathleen reported that the task force still needed to add, decided they needed to add another voting category, particularly where the CEO had indicated noncompliance. That really wasn't covered in what we had presented to you before. However, the task force hadn't finalized the language on that yet. And so we said we would bring it forward tonight, January board meeting. So just in summary, an overview on that before we look at the specific proposal. just want to kind of outline it. There'd be an A, which basically everything is okay on both the interpretation and the compliance. B, and this is the new item that we talked about last time, or Kathleen reported on last time, that the CAO has indicated non-compliance on certain items. And now C is a brand new C, and we talked about this a lot, and it's quite a bit different than what we were thinking about before, because we thought about there's going to be a lot of mixtures of different categories by whatever particular sub policy we're talking about. So we've developed a C that really has four potential findings under it: C1, C2, C3, and C4. The board could vote on just one of those, or maybe even all four of those, just depending on how long the policy is and whether there's certain of the sub policies that the board feels differently on the different ones. And that's kind of a rough explanation. We'll get into that in just a minute in terms of the details. But also for each finding, there would be a follow-up requirement and a date for that revised interpretation, evidence, or compliance, whatever the case may be. And in addition, tonight, we do have also a proposal on how to document those follow-up dates that were agreed to by the board. Let me just add too that I think we mentioned before that the people on the task force are myself, Kathleen, Kyra, and we've been very fortunate to be advised by Rose Mercier, who is here tonight. So I would like everybody to actually go to the proposal that we have in your package, and I think it's on page 21. Please get that in front of you because I wanted to go through that on each item. And I'll read it out. I hope some of these are pretty obvious. We vote A, it means the board has assessed the monitoring report for whatever policy it is. This would be the overriding policy, not the sub policies, and finds that it provides a reasonable interpretation of all policy items and that the evidence demonstrates compliance with those interpretations. That's pretty similar, not fairly similar to the A and the old way of doing it. So B is really the new one that I just mentioned about the board has assessed the policy report for whatever policy and finds it provides reasonable interpretation for all the policy items and that the evidence demonstrates compliance with the interpretation. However, on a particular report, it could be that the CEO has stated a non-compliance with a particular item, which would be mentioned, and that the board presumably acknowledges and accepts that proposal for the dates of compliance. Now let's get into C, which is a little more complicated. First of all, the board has assessed the monitoring report for whatever and finds the overall policy, but finds the following. And it could be C1, C2, C3, C4, it could be a combination of all of those. So, and you'd look at it by policy, by sub policies, not the overall policy. So there could be for a particular policy or several policies on C1 that there's evidence of compliance with reasonable interpretation. 2 for other policies, and they'd be listed that the interpretation is not reasonable. Might be 1 or 2 of those. For C3, for policy items, and it would be enumerated again which one they were. The individual who is filling out the form and determined that the interpretation was reasonable. However, the evidence really didn't demonstrate compliance. And then number C4, for particular policy item, again, the board acknowledges and accepts the CEO stated non-compliance for the proposed dates of compliance. That's different from B, when the board accepted the entire report, except for evidence and for reason and for interpretation. But the CEO, Matt, had just decided that there were certain items that they were not compliant. That's how that would differ from C4. So once that would be voted, that would be submitted by the individual board members, and so what would happen then? Our intent is to have the summary of the reports go to a particular committee. Now, the summary of these reports we've seen before. That's done by staff. They summarize, so and so board of directors decided this, and so a number of board of directors decided that, and so forth. That information and that summary would go to either the finance committee, the service committee, or perhaps even the governance committee to decide on what they would want to recommend to the board. Because there will probably be some differences in terms of the submissions from individual board members. It could be that, for example, only one board member voted on a particular item and thought it was, the interpretation wasn't reasonable. The committee might decide that since all the other board members thought it was a reasonable interpretation, that would not be proposed for going to the board. So they would go through the entire summary of the surveys that came in for board members and really decide among themselves what they would want to present to the board in terms of their recommendation on voting, on getting board approval for whatever motion that might be proposed. And so the board would receive that in their board package. And then at the board meeting, the proposal from the committee would be introduced, and certainly that would be discussed by the board. The board may decide to modify what was recommended. There could be a short discussion, there could be a long discussion, and presumably it could be modified from what was submitted, and that's fine. The board would vote, and it would vote on, and it would require a majority of the board voting on a particular motion. And there may be some back and forth on that, but it would require, of course, a board majority. There probably might be some negative votes on there because people thought, oh, I didn't think that this particular sub policy, the interpretation was not reasonable, for example, or there wasn't good evidence on this other sub policy. But anyway, presumably there would be finally at the board meeting a consensus, or not a consensus, but a majority that would be voted on and approved. Going along with that, you can see also on that first page, there would be a follow-up requested for whatever particular items was judged to be non-compliant, not good interpretation, or not good evidence. And so that form there below, you can see what items require better interpretation, what items need better evidence, when what follow-up was requested, which should be fairly straightforward, and then what date would be that would be proposed in terms of coming back and to correct or modify what was originally submitted. And I think that's really all I had to say right now, but before we go on to any discussion, and I'll turn that over to you, Kathleen, but let's first of all see whether anybody else on the committee or if Rose wanted to add to what I said. That would be you, Kathleen, you, Kyra, or you, Rose. Rose is putting her thumbs up, so I don't think she doesn't have anything to add.
If I might, Mike, I just wanted to add one thing. Your report was excellent, and it was everything that we discussed. There's just, I wasn't sure if I heard it or not. We did add an extra follow-up with when the board comes up with, they want to re-look at policy language. In other words, does the policy meet our needs? Does it need revamping? Do we need a new policy? There is also an area for us to explore that on the follow-up form so that we have a way of holding ourselves accountable to our policy. And Kyra just is not available this evening, Mike, so she will not be giving her input.
Okay, but yes, certainly another thing on the form, on the survey that would be turned in are those questions at the end, which include whether anybody thought that there was a policy that needed to be revised. And that, yes, that certainly is appropriate to go on this follow-up form. Or follow-up documentation. And I might add, and let's not get to it yet, but on the very next page is our suggestion about how to track the required follow-ups. But I think it's appropriate to have a discussion first. And the most important thing is to discuss what the task force is proposing. Obviously, it's up to the board to decide what they want to go forward on. And Kathleen, why don't you take over the moderation of this?
All right, Mike. Does anyone have any questions for Mike or the task force with regards to what the proposed motions are? Do you have any feelings or thoughts about the wording, or is it meeting our needs as a board? Rich?
So I gotta say, it's been really neat to see the evolution of this process. I am a fan of just, let's give it a whirl and see what happens.
Fair enough. Simi, did you have your hand up? No, okay. Mike, sorry, Mr. Carpenter.
I'm flattered, I'll take it. There's a question of clarification for Mike, because I haven't been a part of all of these conversations. And this is sort of a hypothetical, Mike, so bear with me. If the board receives a monitoring report and they like all of the main policy and the sub-policies, all of them, and all the interpretations are reasonable and all the evidence is compelling, would they just make a motion to adopt it as an A? And that would cover everything in there? Or would they have to also go
No,
line by line through C?
no. A is the home run. There wouldn't be anything else.
Okay, so you only see C being necessary if some of the sub-policies maybe aren't as up to snuff, and the board wants to sort of cherry pick through there in terms of which ones are meeting expectations or not.
Exactly. And of course, the same goes for B is A. If the board thinks everything is fine in terms of interpretation and in terms of evidence, but you have identified an area or two that you do not think you are compliant, that would be B, and that would be a standalone also. Would not involve C or would not involve A.
Good question.
And just like Rich said, I certainly agree. Once we try this on the board and on the committees that would be responsible for reviewing it ahead of the board, we may come up with, we may find out things that would make us consider revising this proposal. And we really can't know that until, as Rich said, we've really tested it out.
Did you have a follow-up, Mr. Carpenter?
No, thank you. That answers my question.
Awesome. Any other questions for Mike? So as a board, do we say what Rich said and give it a whirl and maybe vote on it and implement it so that we can give it a test drive for our next policy monitoring and see if we have any bugs that need to be worked out? If so, would someone like to entertain a motion?
So moved, Rich.
Okay, so Rich, you're making a motion that we accept the proposed motion as written?
Correct.
Okay. And do I have a second? And seconded by Jesse. All in favor, please raise your hand or say aye. It looks like we have passed that unanimously. Good job, Mike. And so now we need to move on to the second part of this process,
Yeah.
correct, Mike?
Yes, that is right. Just look at the next page. It's just what we thought would be a good way to follow up what was voted on at the board. And you can see there's different columns there where the CEO identified something to be followed up on. Where, and of course, you can see the meeting date over there in the left-hand column, and there would be policies or sub-policies that, excuse me, they're in the second column. So the first, starting with the third column, that would be, again, where Matt had identified something that wasn't, that he didn't think was compliant. The next column is where there was, where something on interpretation needed to be followed up. The next column where something on evidence needed to be followed up. And then and just like what you brought up that I had omitted, Kathleen, the last column has to do with whether there was anything identified where a policy, where it was thought that the policy perhaps needed to be revised. And so a date would go in there too, along with a particular policy or sub-policy. I think it's pretty straightforward. But maybe there's something we didn't see. And I don't think we need to vote on this. I think it's just something that we'll do unless somebody thinks it needs to be voted on.
Go ahead, Rich.
I really like this a lot. I think it's really going to help us to be held accountable. A suggestion maybe is just in the columns, which I really like the way this is laid out, is maybe add the letters and the associated number. So for instance, like that second column, which is the follow-up identified by CEO, is just add B to that. So I think that is the one that fits there. And then the other three columns would be like C2, C3, and C4.
That's a good idea.
Cool.
Excellent suggestion. Go ahead, Rich.
I did have one other question though. So say we have this row that's like an example, right, for 2.1. If there's multiples for C2, so right now it's like 2.1.4. What if it's like 2.1.4 and 2.1.5 also fall under C2? How does that get represented in here? Because I'll have different completion dates. Do we just add like another row to that cell?
Yeah, I would think it just another row.
Okay.
But anyone else give your opinion?
So you would have just like another, so the row below it, for instance, would be like 23-01-19, 2.1, and then you just have just blank would
Yeah.
be.
Yeah, they're for let's say under 2.1, there could be 3 or 4 sub policies under there that need following up in certain columns.
Okay, sounds good.
Mike, should I throw into the discussion that we had, which was who is going to be the keeper of the follow-up monitoring reports?
I think that's a good idea. We did discuss that, and I think we had a volunteer. Did we not?
We did. Do you want me to say? So you're deferring to me, is that what's
Yeah,
happening?
no, no.
So when we were,
We recall that we did have a volunteer, and the volunteer said it was probably a good responsibility for the secretary.
I did, it was Jesse. Jesse, as
Oh.
secretary several months ago, had identified that he believed that it would fall under the purview of being the secretary to be able to follow up on action items such as these policies. And so we didn't want to just volunteer you unilaterally, but I'm wondering if you would be up to the task of doing that?
No, I'm definitely still feel that the responsibility would fall to me. I might want to set up a meeting. I believe Rosa Maria, you've been doing some kind of tracking of this, so I might want to have a meeting with you to kind of take all the work that you've done on this and kind of put this together. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I think the other thing to mention quite quickly is that then that created a discussion around the secretary and treasurer duties that they're not in the policy manual. And this can be a discussion for governance, but I just wanted to put that bug in your ear that the secretary and the treasurer are identified in the, okay, what's the word I'm looking for? No, not the articles, the bylaws.
Bylaw?
Maybe they are in the articles as
Bylaws.
well, but for the bylaws. But there was, I believe Rose Mercier raised the question of, we do discuss the CGO's role, the chair role, but the secretary and the treasurer are not currently in our policies. So if it's okay with the board, that discussion may want to happen at the governance level with regards to, do we need to have explicit policies in place describing job duties, or are the articles of incorporation and the other document more than enough to describe what it is that is being done, and then it doesn't need to be covered under policy? Go ahead, Jesse.
I think that's something the governance committee needs to look at, because the duties as described in the articles of incorporation don't really fit with the style of governance that we do. And we dealt with this with the treasurer, I think, last year.
Yeah.
There are other things for the secretary. According to that, I'm supposed to be keeping the minutes of the meeting. I'm sorry, I'm not doing that. If you want me to, I will. But so yeah, I think we need to. I think it might be good to lay that out in the bylaws.
All right, and knowing
Actually-
go ahead.
Excuse me, I think we discussed that and we decided it's probably best just in the policy and not in the bylaws.
Right. Sorry. I did misspeak. I meant, yeah, not the bylaws, the whatever part 3, whatever.
The governance
Yeah,
process.
the governance policies. Yep. Thank you, Mike.
So what I can do then is I can kick it to the governance committee. This is not going to be an immediate, it's going to take some time. We all have a lot on our plate. There are a lot of moving pieces right now, but know that it will go into our plan of work, and we will discuss it and move it forward when it's time, if everyone is comfortable with that. If anybody objects to that, now would be the best time to say that. Okay, I don't see any objections. So Mike, I'm not sure, I'm going to defer and ask Mr. Carpenter for his guidance. Since this is a housekeeping issue, this follow-up form, does it require any sort of acceptance on the board in terms of making a motion to say this is what we want to do? Or because it's housekeeping and would go to the secretary, it's just that housekeeping?
Just for clarity, do you mean the adoption and use of the tracking form
Correct.
with a deferral of who's holding on to it pending governance committee discussion?
Basically what I'm saying is Mike, we've already made a motion and accepted the proposed motions as they are, and we're going to adopt them next month. I'm wondering if the form that's been proposed, if everyone likes it, do we need to have a formal adoption of this form?
Sure.
Or is it just housekeeping and we just use this form because it's that?
So this form is a board tool.
Okay.
This is not a staff tool, it belongs to you. As to whether or not you vote or just look for consensus, I think that's up to you. It doesn't, I don't know that it requires a vote, but it is, if any of you have any lack of certainty about it, you might want to vote. because it is your tool and probably should reflect the will of the board. But if there's consensus, I don't see why we can't just begin using it at your direction.
And I'm going to say that since no one had any negative feedback, we were all pretty positive. But I will open it up once again if there needs to be any discussion. If you have concerns, now would be the best time to raise that. All right, well, seeing none, then we will not need to take a vote because we all are in consensus, and we will just go ahead and move on. Mike, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I just wanted, regarding the form, I think when Jesse is going to be the one who keeps it, fills it out, et cetera, he may, when he's doing it, come up with some modifications to it, and I think that would be fine.
Thank you. I appreciate the flexibility.
Excellent. All right, then I think we're ready to move on to 3.3, which is policy 2.9 update, and that is Mr. Miller.
All right, thank you, Chair. Service Committee did further discussion of Policy 2.9 as we've been directed to. Rose Mercier joined us for the meeting, and I would direct board members to our packet beginning on page 24 of the packet. And then especially if you go a few pages down, starting on page 27, I believe we saw this at the last meeting. Or was this the last meeting or was that at the Service Committee? Anyhow, you've all had this packet, so I'm trusting that you all read it. This is where Ms. Mercier goes into how she would, her recommendations for how the policy should be adjusted, and I will let her speak to that, but I will say before that after some pretty robust discussion, the Service Committee felt that we were all comfortable with accepting the changes as she proposed them. But at that point, I'll hand it off to you, Rose.
All right. Since we have seen this before, I'll just, I think this conversation started with looking at, started with the monitoring report on 2.9, and I think some of the feedback to that report had been that a lot of the elements or a lot of the policy items in 2.9 were either what we would call management prescriptions, which are things that where the board tells the CEO precisely what to do and don't really comply with the idea or aren't consistent with the intent of a management limitation policy. So then we started looking at the other elements of the policy, and that it seemed that a number of the items in that policy were really more about the protection of the organization's credibility, and which fit more with the protection of assets policy. And so my suggestion was that basically that the policies get realigned, that those items that fit with protection of assets be shifted, and those items that were not management or were really limitations be deleted. And that further with the protection of assets, that there were some other items that were worthwhile considering as additions. And so I think that's the, if you will, the basis of the feedback that I provided to the Service Committee that was, as Jesse said, the subject of some quite robust conversation. So. Shall I, is there something else you'd like me to say? Thinking.
No, I think that's, I appreciate that. I might say we did have some of the conversation revolved a lot around the philosophy of what 2.9 was really trying to get at. I think there was some agreement that the hearts were in the right place, and that what most of the work was really distilling what was the responsibility of staff and how to frame that in terms of executive limitations appropriately, and also identifying what some of those roles are that were really the more board responsibilities. That we have a responsibility for as board members for external relations, and that does tie in with the work that Rich was doing. So My personal feeling, and I would invite any of the other committee members to speak up, but my feeling was that there was really nothing from the policy as written that we were throwing away. It was really mostly, it was all resorting it into clearer staff expectations versus board expectations. But those board expectations are something that does need to be developed. And with that, I guess, do I have any questions from the rest of the board?
Did anyone on the service committee want to add anything? And Jesse, at this point also, I'm looking at this and I may be the only one who may be a little bit confused by the sheer amount of information that is here in terms of trying to distill it down to making a decision. Are we going to use this time for discussion, kick it back to you all so that you can actually just pull out the parts that would move and make it more comprehensible? I'm trying to figure out what the next steps are.
Yeah,
Go ahead, please.
Go ahead, Rose.
was that I think the next step is I had prepared a series of essentially motions that would enable the changes to policies that are probably hidden, if you will, or inherent in the document that you have. And I think that the service committee should review those motions to make sure, but all of the motions basically have a rationale for them so that it becomes clear the changes that are being made and kind of working through them step by step. So that I think that's probably the service committee to review and then to probably, I'm thinking probably bring that back to the next board meeting.
So based on what everyone has read in their packet and some of the changes that, all of the changes that have been highlighted in here, does anybody have any questions or concerns? Mike has his hand raised. We'll go with Mike first.
Well, thank you. I pretty much concur with what you said, Kathleen. It looks like some really good work here. There's no doubt a lot of changes needed to be made and consolidated and eliminated things and so forth, but it was very confusing. And I didn't see anything I disagreed with in there, but there was so much there and it wasn't all together in one document. I think that's what was just said is what's needed. It needs to be put in a specific proposal that we can vote on next month.
Do you have anything else, Jesse?
No, I think I appreciate the support, and I guess, yeah, we'll look for those recommended proposals from you, Rose, and the service committee will take a look at them at our next meeting.
Okay, and I just want to make sure that everybody has had an opportunity for right now to have an opportunity to speak if you have any questions about what this document said, or are you ready to just go ahead and wait for the service committee to digest Rose's proposals, and then we'll see this, probably at the next board meeting in February? Okay, seeing no hands raised, then I thank you so much, Service Committee and Rose. Oh, go ahead, Jesse.
I'm sorry that I needed to. There was one exception to my my statement that we weren't throwing anything out, and that was current policy 297 that the CEO shall not allow the organization to be without advisory committees required in legislation, et cetera. That policy we had discussed had been written mainly to make sure that we maintained the LAC, but we felt, and we got some concurrence from the chair, that that policy was addressed elsewhere at this point with, and so I just wanted to clear that up. That is one policy that you won't see reflected in the final markup.
Yeah, I believe when we talked about, and I can't remember the policy that speaks directly to it, but it basically says the CEO will not do something illegal. And the LAC is a mandate from the state of Michigan. It's a legal issue, so we felt comfortable eliminating that.
All right, that's it.
Okay. No, we appreciate all of it. Thank you so much. Alrighty then, we're gonna go ahead and move on to Global Executive Limitations Monitoring Report, 3.4, Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. So here to present the monitoring report for 2.0. This is the global executive constraint. All other executive limitations are clarifications of this main policy. So they all roll up into this one policy. I have provided an interpretation that essentially says you have fully articulated your expectations in all of the sub-policies 2.1 through 2.11, and that by complying with all of them at a level A, and that may be changing with your new rating structure, but we'll update this, that would demonstrate compliance with this overall policy. So it is a roll-up, as one board member noted in their survey response. I did, however, set the bar a little high for myself. I said I'm going to get an A on everything, and there are a couple of Bs in here. I'd say about half Bs. So that is, I think, a good part of the non-compliance, or excuse me, partially compliant recommendation from me that this be found by you to be partially compliant. B's not bad, it's a solid, 3.0 if you want to be old school about it. There's a D here as well, thankfully not old school. That was a cannot be determined. That was from the construction policy. You may recall that had to do simply, we hadn't done any construction, and the board's decision was, well, we don't know, because we haven't done any construction. The one element of that got kicked back was the question about whether earmarks should be counted as grants for financial controls of applications. That has been kicked back to the Finance Committee for their discussion. So that is the main reason for my suggestion that this might be partially compliant. When we look at the board responses, starting on page 36, they raise some good points, particularly about the compliance timeline. In a bit of referring to another source, in our compliance timeline for this monitoring report, we did say, see the other monitoring reports, because that's where they all had their own compliance timelines. And some board members felt, they'd like to see them here in this report as sort of a roll-up. I would leave it to the board in terms of what your expectations are. If you want to see that information in this table, I think we could probably do it. Just a little more work on the staff side to compile that information. But I would defer to you in terms of your expectations. Otherwise, the survey response I thought were very helpful. I will rest and see what questions there may be.
So the floor is opened up to the board to ask questions about this report. And I would be interested to know further the comment that Mr. Carpenter just referred to with regards to the policy. In what we should probably have further discussion, is there more than one person who feels that way? Or is it just the person who raised the issue? Is it okay if I out you? Can whoever raised that issue maybe speak to it just a little bit more, so that everyone on the board has an understanding of what is being discussed? Go ahead, Jesse.
Are you asking who identified that they couldn't see like timelines for the sub-policies, or?
You had mentioned that there was further information that someone wanted that they didn't see in the report. And it was the board's purview to decide whether or not they wanted to see that either a follow-up or in future reports. And because it's a board decision about what they want to see, it should not be spoken to by just one person. And so I wanted to entertain dialogue. I don't want this person or persons to feel that they're not being heard, but also the full board should understand what it is they're being asked to think about for the future. Go ahead, Rich.
So if I use the method that we just talked about in regards to policy, how we handle them, like, to me, I think this is an example of, like, that, this would probably fall into, like, C, whatever, one of the C levels, right, C2, C3, or whatever. So, I think it's fair that, we probably should ask, because we are going to ask for that moving forward anyways with the new way that we're handling policy, reports. So I would say, yes, I think we should ask that they do add, the timeline regarding when that sub-policy is actually going to be met.
Jesse?
I mean, I agree with the timeline aspect. I do think this would be B since we're agreeing with what Matt said. But it does say that acknowledges and accepts the proposed dates for compliance, and we don't have any dates for compliance expressed in this policy. So I think we do need to hear from the CEO when we can expect compliance with this policy. Sorry.
How's tomorrow? In all honesty, I don't have at the tip of my fingers all of the dates for, because there's a lot of policies here, right? And there's some of them that were, have already been compliant, but were marked as non-compliant in the monitoring report, but they've since been fixed. Other things that are much more like, yeah, this is going to take 2 years, but I don't remember which ones are which off the top of my head today. That would suggest to me, this discussion might suggest to me that you find the evidence incomplete simply because they don't include some sort of summary of those timelines. If that, because if that were presented, it would then be more the evidence it sounds like you're interested in seeing. The evidence, I mean, that information exists. It's just that it's in the other monitoring reports right now, and this one just like gives a footnote and refers you to them. The difference is how that information is presented and displayed here in this report. So in terms of how fast we could update this table, that's probably a couple weeks, just based on other workload, if that's what the board would like to see. I can't answer off the top of my head how long it'll take to comply with all the other areas throughout the policy manual.
Mr. Elming, you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you. I believe I was the one who specifically mentioned that there were no timelines in here. However, was very interested in seeing the one comment there that talked about that this report is basically a roll-up or summary of the sub-monitoring reports in policy 2.0, and that's exactly what it was. And the more I thought about that, the more I just wondered whether this is really has any meaning. It's really, the meaning is in the sub policies. Trying to do the top level of that. I mean, it's really what the sub policies were, and that's kind of what it was identified there. But you can't really judge it from looking at what's here. And particularly, I think if we're having this follow-up schedule prepared, we can see that pretty well, and maybe with the addition of what sub-policies didn't require any follow-up at all. And I think that, to me, that would be an adequate, in fact, a much better way of addressing 2.0. Is just looking at the individual sub-policies and Matt not having to make an overall statement like he has had here. We just look at what the board decided on the sub-policies. We've got them in front of us, and maybe with the addition of which ones were voted as A that required no follow-up. This just doesn't seem like a worthwhile exercise the way it's designed.
Mr. Carpenter?
Thank you. And Mike, I noted that comment too, and I thank whoever brought it forward. Rose Mercier, Rosa, and myself have had a couple of what I call very preliminary conversations. Apparently, interpreting this policy, this is a boilerplate, high-level policy for policy governance. It's a very important one, actually. But interpreting it in a way that's meaningful is a bit of a challenge. Rose has given me some things to think about in this space. And it's an area I'd like to continue to work on to try to make a monitoring report that does provide something that's more useful, more than, and again, more than perhaps just the timelines. But I confess I'm struggling with exactly what that would look like, what's not articulated in one of the sub-policies that I would put in here to demonstrate compliance. So I do hope I have the opportunity to continue to work with Rose and Rosa on finding a way to update the interpretation to make it maybe a little more useful, if the board is willing to, give me that time.
So it seems to, Rose, did you have anything you wanted to add, Ms. Messier?
No, I think Matt has said sufficient. There's some. I've given him some other ideas, and I think we could keep working on that. So, yeah.
So it sounds like, if I'm hearing everything correctly, where we're at is we are going to, the recommendation was to accept it as B, except for items as noted. And then the items as noted, we would ask for some sort of follow-up to address the concern. Is that what I'm hearing correctly, or am I misinterpreting?
My impression is, based on your earlier conversation, you guys were interested in the future in seeing the timelines for compliance presented here with this monitoring report. That might be the thing you note. If I want to work with Rose to come up with a whole better interpretation, that's between me and Rose.
Okay, so in other words, we'll accept the monitoring report as it is, except for B, but the new interpretation would come at the next monitoring report, that we don't want any follow-up within the next few months to add the additional information that people were seeking. Is that what I'm hearing? Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, so I'm actually the guilty party that brought up the issue about this report, because I think the rest of my comment was like, do we even need this as a policy report? Because to me, it just seemed like it was more informational summary. And so I actually agree, and thank you for reminding, because I couldn't even remember what this one was about, with Matt saying like, hey, getting a timeline seems a little weird, because we do have, that was part of another policy that we gave him some to-dos. So I would like to retract my recent comment saying like, hey, I would like to see some dates. But I think us as a board, maybe we should kind of discuss like, is this particular policy that it's turned to policy, does it actually need to be this way? Or is it just something that they can include as part of the board packet that gives us a summary of where things have stood with the existing policies as they are?
Well, my interpretation is this policy is extremely important, in that this is one of those policies that holds the CEO accountable for monitoring, and you just stated that it was a boilerplate policy that was pretty high in policy governance in the John Carver method. I don't know that would anybody else want to entertain revisiting it? Rose, would you see any benefit in tweaking it, or is this just a common, as Mr. Carpenter said, a common issue that happens in all boards that deal with policy governance?
Let me start at the beginning. Is I would not ever recommend eliminate. This is really the policy that holds all of the other management limitation policies. So essentially it says don't do anything unethical, imprudent, unlawful, or against. And it really acts as, if you will, as a backstop in the instance where decision or circumstance or action, is considered by the CEO and it isn't covered in any other policy. You come back to this one and go, it's still imprudent, so it's outside of the boundaries that the board has set. The monitoring this policy is often a challenge for boards, or it's often a challenge for CEOs to think about what is it that the board has not further interpreted in its in the other management limitations. And my suggestion was that sometimes the area that is not fully interpreted is that of unlawful, and that it might be worthwhile considering what other, if you will, legislation or regulation has not been addressed in other further numbered policies. And so that's kind of the area to explore. And it's usually the area that gets overlooked. So I would say, yes, you want to keep monitoring it, and B, I think we want to work on the content of that monitoring policy, and you should continue to monitor it.
Go ahead.
You don't need to monitor it annually if you want. Like, you could expand its kind of expand the length of time. Let's say you might monitor it every other year, for example, but because because the other policies are pretty fully interpreted, the general executive constraint.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, that it kind of reminds me of a thought. We did talk about this a little bit at the service committee, that actually the evidence supported doesn't actually necessarily speak to what's written in policy 2.0. That really maybe a more accurate interpretation of or the way that the executive limitations work is that, like, we have this global constraint which is policy 2.0, and then in what it is that policy governance language that we're being asked to think about, like, with the executive limitations, this is what the CEO can't do, even if it achieves the ends and is not in violation of laws. So all those other policies, like the sub policies of 2.0, don't actually speak to policy 2.0, because 2.0 has already covered all of those, like, legal requirements. That's why we don't have the LAC, why we're potentially removing the LAC, is because it's part of policy 2.0 in terms of the CEO can't break the law. So, and he has not actually provided any evidence for having not broken the law. So I'm actually now kind of thinking that maybe I need to, with what Rose just said, perhaps I'm not feeling that this is actually relevant evidence to the policy.
Go ahead, Mr. Carpenter.
I think Mr. Miller has a point, and Rose has raised this, and this has been a bit of a struggle for me. So, and to use the unlawful one, I do cite compliance with a lot of laws in some of the other policies, Americans with Disabilities Act being a good example. But if you remove the one about the LAC as a specific policy, where would I provide evidence for you that I've complied with that? It might be self-evident that the LAC continues to meet, or maybe just there aren't any complaints that it ceased meeting, but that's not the same thing as I provided you evidence that I'm complying with the state law that we have in LAC. Part of the challenge I've had with this one is, how many laws would I need to provide evidence of compliance for? There's probably just a couple hundred. How am I going to give you something that makes any sort of sense? That's a rundown of that. How far down that rabbit hole do I go? And then there's the question of unethical behavior. And I think this is why this is important, because this is the one that says behave ethically. I don't think you actually have any other policy anywhere else that requires me to behave ethically. You've got bits and pieces of it scattered, but that's the only place you really say that. So that's another very sort of big, important, hairy thing that arguably has not been defined very well in this interpretation. I would say this is an area I would like to work on more, but I struggle with it. As Rose suggested, I think a lot of people struggle with it.
I think, I appreciate that consideration. I would maybe remind you that you have, in providing evidence for other policies, said that I am in compliance because there have been no lawsuits against us, because because you were not subject to a criminal investigation, and it has been rather broad, and we as a board have accepted that interpretation. So I think with as broad as this policy is, I think we as a board have demonstrated that we can accept a equally broad justification. That the evidence or the lack of evidence, showing that you violated this policy is in of itself evidence of compliance. We've done that a lot. And as you point out, with the specific, you said, we're in compliance with the ADA because no one said that we weren't. So I think that would apply just as well here to the broader the broader policy as it does to the more specific sub-policies.
I do appreciate the consideration, thank you. And yes, I do make evidentiary claims that because no one sued us, we must not have broken a law. I'm sure everyone sees why that's not entirely satisfying. I could be breaking a law, it's just that no one's noticed yet. As we've adopted policy governance, all these things have been sort of evolving, and we've been getting a little bit better every time. This is one that I still feel is kind of, we haven't had the bandwidth to really bear down on how to document this properly. I'd actually personally prefer to find a better evidentiary response to you than, well, we haven't been sued yet or charged with a crime. Okay, it's a good stopgap piece of evidence, but I would always like to do something better than that. That feels weak. And it would roll up here. Any legal compliance issue that wasn't directly addressed in the sub-policy. Should I be addressing it here? To what level of detail? I just haven't had time to get my head around what would that look like? And I haven't found many good examples of other CEOs interpreting this policy any better than this. Almost everything I've found looks like a roll-up of something like this with maybe a couple other things thrown in. But this is an area I think that's still evolving. I'm not entirely satisfied with it, to be perfectly honest. I think it's a placeholder. In this conversation, I think we've surfaced a couple things that without the compliance timelines for the other policies, just the table of evidence is a little unsatisfying. But we've also discussed some of the shortcomings with the interpretation more broadly. I can accept, if the board, feels like the interpretation is acceptable, kind of, sort of, or you'd like to see it redone, I can accept either one of them. It's just a question of how much time is it going to take me to come up with a better, more fulsome interpretation.
Any other thoughts from the board members? Go ahead, Jesse.
I just want to put it out there for discussion. I'm considering proposing this as C, just saying with C2 that the interpretation is not reasonable. But that said, I don't have any sense of urgency for, I'm willing to just let this sit for another year. I don't think this is, I think this is a worthwhile thing to explore. I don't think it's an urgent thing that should take the CEO away from his other responsibilities for the immediate future. But that's my thought.
Does anyone have any counter thoughts to that, or what Jesse proposing satisfactory? So, Jesse, would you like to turn that into a motion?
So I definitely hear where definitely see where you're coming from, but the thing is, like, when I look at the proposed motions that we have for, like, oh wait, are we using our existing?
That's what I was doing.
Yeah, so you're thinking like C2?
Yeah, I was saying C2, that the evidence that he's providing does not actually demonstrate compliance with the policy.
So I think the reason why I have my question is I thought the whole thing was the C block was actually just specific sub-policies. Because I think what you're saying is, like, with 2.0 overall, you're not happy with the.
Well, this is the only policy. I mean, normally when we're doing a policy, there are sub-policies, but we've only got 2.0. We're not looking at any of the others. So, we're just, my understanding of this is that we are looking solely at policy 2.0. Now, he has provided as evidence his the reports for all the other sub-policies, but I'm saying that's not actually a fair interpretation of this policy, because those sub-policies are not the definition of the global policy. They are, in fact, like, further enumerations and, like, that we are not attempting in all of those, and in all of those sub-policies to say that we've covered every practice, activity, decision, or organizational circumstance that is unlawful. We're just saying these are some specific things, like, in addition to the global policy, we also want to talk specifically about all these other aspects.
Well, so I would maybe propose that we continue with its actually interpretation. In my mind, is reasonable. I think we had a action that we could say that, but say that we had to review the policy. Because I think that's the challenge right now. Is like I think the wording makes it difficult for the CEO to actually work with this, whether they are providing enough interpretation data or proof versus not.
I defer to Rose.
Go ahead, Rose.
So a couple of things here. One is that the general executive constraint, like part of the interpretation is that the board is further interpreted unethical, imprudent, unlawful in its policies, in its other management limitation policies. I think it's a reasonable interpretation to say that given compliance with those lower level policies, all right, demonstrates compliance along with, which might be sort of the further areas of interpretation that, as Matt indicated, he'd like to continue to work on, all right? So I think it's not, saying that there's evidence of that which has been interpreted, all right? There are possibly areas that could require further interpretation, but require some further thinking and work to actually provide that. So, I guess I would just be, I'm not sure how to say that. It's not that the policy is challenging to provide an interpretation for. I agree, but it doesn't mean you should change that policy. Like I don't know if that is helpful or more confusing. But
I think that is my feeling, that I think this policy is important because it covers everything that isn't covered by all the sub-policies.
Correct. That is correct.
And so why I'm saying C2, that the interpretation isn't reasonable, is because he has explicitly stated that his interpretation is that this policy will, that compliance will be demonstrated when all of the other sub-policies are in compliance. And I'm saying, yeah, that's part of it, but it's not enough. It's not addressing the global constraint. It's only addressing, the global constraint includes more than just the sub-limitations. It's the sub-limitations and we're missing the and everything else.
Oh, Rose, go ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, your hand is still up. I'm sorry. Matt, did you have something?
I think that's fair enough. I think maybe it's probably, this is a good example of board holism, if we all think we should figure this out. Because we can talk through about this for a long time. So I actually am swinging toward what Jesse's saying around this. So I think maybe we as a board decide if we want to go with that C2 or not.
So would someone like to make a formal recommendation, formal motion? I think Matt still has something. Oh, Matt, did you have something in addition? I'm sorry.
Sure. I'd just like to volunteer that I agree with Jesse as well. It is a C2. I'm in a long way around about it. I'm not entirely satisfied with my own interpretation. I appreciate that he thinks, yeah, okay, you got part of it. And I'm glad that I've gotten away with this one for about 3 years now, but you finally noticed how many holes are in it. So I'm really glad that you finally see all the holes. They're the same ones I've kind of been like, that's going to bite me in the rear eventually. But I haven't figured out how to do it. So if you find it as a C2, that's perfectly reasonable, and I think an evidence of just you guys becoming much more able to see, through my interpretations when they have holes, which is good. I'll work with Rose if you come to that conclusion, and even if you don't. and Rosa to try to figure out how to give you a better interpretation. This is a sticky one, though, for all the reasons we discussed. So I'd appreciate your leniency, and if it maybe comes back in a year, I'll have something better.
Mike Alamang has his hand up.
I'm likewise become comfortable with this, with the C2 vote, but I hasten to add, we probably should at least discuss potential timeline for a follow-up. And maybe in this case, it's just to be determined, but we shouldn't ignore that.
Go ahead, Jesse.
That actually, I have a question. Did the monitoring task force talk about when, like in what part of the process the timelines would be requested? Like, do we have the vote and then discuss a timeline, or does the discussion of a timeline need to happen before the vote? Yeah.
There's actually a part here at the bottom that says for policy items cited, the board expects follow-up by the following dates. So I believe that the motion would be C2 with an expected follow-up date of blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
For policy. I am inclined to be thinking that this is a really big sticky one, and knowing everything that is happening behind the scenes, I would be perfectly comfortable with followed up with the next interpretation or the next policy monitoring. That would give Mr. Carpenter time to speak with Rose, do some really good thought-provoking banter back and forth to really figure this out and nail it down. And then I would also suggest that maybe it could then just, in 6 months or so, just sort of be kicked to the governance committee, just to hear where you are in the process, not to actually get your interpretation or anything like that, but just know that, you know, there is some traction being made with you and Rose. But I would be perfectly comfortable at this juncture saying see, and then we'll just see the next interpretation at the next monitoring period. But that's just my opinion, and if somebody has a differing, I would love to, know it.
So just to
Go
clarify,
ahead,
so you're
Rich.
saying for the next 2.0?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Correct, that would be next year, that would be a whole year. But I really hesitate to say, we want this in 3 months, or we want this in 6 months, especially knowing that we've heard from Rose Mercier, our governance coach, where she has let us know that this is a sticky situation, not just for our board, for all boards that have this policy monitoring. So I believe that would give him ample time to explore and come back to us, especially knowing everything that's on the plate. I don't know that this is to me, this isn't a house fire. This is sort of just something lurking and that needs to be taken care of. Jesse, I see you have your hand.
Yeah, I was just taking a look at, this policy is actually due in December and assessed in January. Does that sound, Matt, does that sound like, do you need 2 years? No, all right. Maybe.
I based on what Kathleen articulated of giving me a year, I would give you a new interpretation by December. It's my understanding. Works for me.
Okay.
Ask me again in November.
So Jesse, would you like to make a formal motion since you've been carrying a lot of this conversation?
Yeah, and I thank you all for bearing with me. Yes, I'd like to propose that we accept this as C2, that the policy 2.0 is, the interpretation is not reasonable, with a timeline for follow-up on December of 2023.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Rich is seconding. All in favor, say aye or raise your hands. Awesome. Thank you so much. And I am really proud of us. I think we just did a really good job at having a good discussion about something that has been on our docket for quite a while, as Mr. Carpenter alluded to. We're really making some good progress, so good job, guys. All right, then. So we're going to move on to the next item on our agenda, which is another policy. We're going to actually begin discussion. This isn't a decision-making item. It is on the ends monitoring report that is in your packet. I believe it is starting on page 38 for anybody in the public who is following. And Mr. Carpenter, we're going to kick that right back to you.
Thank you very much. The ends are your most important policies in some respects, and once a year we provide a monitoring report to you about the last year's worth of compliance with those. In a moment I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Rosa Maria, but just as a preview, we're only introducing this monitoring report tonight. We are not asking you for a decision. Our purpose tonight is only to introduce it, to orient you to what is a somewhat intimidating document with a lot of graphs, orient you to it, answer preliminary questions, and then after this meeting, probably the survey will be released to you, and then you have another month to actually go through it. So this is just a warm-up. Take it away, Rosa.
Thank you, Matt. Okay, perfect. All right, so you have the packet on page 39, and I'm just going to hit the highlights of the monitoring report. So beginning with policy 1.0, it's partially compliant, and that's because policy 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 are partially compliant. Policy 1.1 is partially compliant because 1.1.2, which talks about equitable access for people with disabilities and mobility impairments, was partially compliant, and that was because of two reasons. Number one, we had the real-time display of information at the Blake Transit Center malfunctional for some time, and that has since then been corrected. And then secondly, we have a target of getting all our bus stops that are near sidewalks to be accessible. Right now, we have 377 bus stops that are near sidewalks that are not accessible. To get them to be accessible, we need staffing, funding, and issuance of permits. During the monitoring period for this monitoring report, we were issued with 3 permits, and those were constructed. Moving forward, we're hoping to get 3 to 4 permits, and so that would put us within a timeline of 10 years to get all the 377 bus stops that are near sidewalks not accessible be accessible. So that's policy 1.1. Moving on to policy 1.2, it's partially compliant because policy 1.21 cannot be determined at the moment, and policy 1.23 and 1.24 are partially compliant. Now, policy 1.21 talks about public transportation options being increasingly chosen over the use of a personal vehicle. If you remember, in previous board reports, we provided data that was 5 years old, 3 years old. We're working on getting data that's during the monitoring period, and so we're working with SEMCOG to get that data. We're still in communication. We have not received that data yet, so we can now determine compliance for this policy. As soon as we get that data, we'll provide that information to you, hopefully within 6 months, but maybe even hopefully sooner than that. So moving on to policy 1.23, it says public transportation options produce conditions favorable to more compact and walkable land development. So for this policy, our target is having, we have specific targets. The library is now closed. Okay. So we have targets for major corridors. So depending on whether the bus operations are during peak times or during the day, during the weekend, during the weekday, it could be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. We don't meet targets for two corridors on Sunday evening, and that's Plymouth Road and Parkhead. So on Sunday, our target is to have it at 30 minutes, but right now we're running at 60 minutes. Based on the long-range plan, we will get into compliance in 2024, which is just next year. And then policy 1.24 is partially compliant, and that talks about relevant public policy is transit supportive. That is partially compliant because the Michigan Department of Transportation currently does not allow dedicated bus lanes or shoulder lane bus operations. We're hoping that within 5 to 10 years we'll be compliant. And then finally, policy 1.3 is partially compliant because policy 1.31 which says public transportation facilitates labor mobility, is partially compliant. Now, for the interpretation for this policy, we'd like to see more people using transit options to access jobs. Based on data during this monitoring period, we actually had an increase of 1.6% in the Ypsilanti area, but it looks like in Ann Arbor there's probably more remote work, and so there was a drop in the of 2% of the people that are actually using transit to access jobs, and because of that, we reported partial compliance. We think we're reporting a compliance timeline of 2 to 3 years. Now, the rest of the policy is compliant, and I would invite you to review it and review the policy, the interpretations, and the evidence. We will be sending out the survey tomorrow, and we invite you to participate. Usually, we provide 2 weeks. We'll provide 3 weeks because this is a big report, and it's the main report. And then we'll look forward to getting your decision during the next board meeting. Thank you.
Before Rosa goes, I just want to see, or Rosa Maria, I just wanted to see if the board might have any questions for her at this time. All right, thank you so much, Rosa Maria. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right, we've got some work ahead of us. We'll look forward to getting that in our emails tomorrow and spending the next 2 weeks giving a really good hearty. I had an opportunity to review it, and it really appeared that a lot of thought and effort went into this, and the rationale for noncompliance was compelling but understandable. So thank you again for all your hard work. We're going to move on to strategy and oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Rich, I didn't see your hand there. Apologize.
I just had one quick question. Sorry, Matt. The board's conclusions on the monitoring report, that section is going to get revised, correct? Because to fit the new method.
In the next packet, yeah, it'll have the now, because we couldn't have it in there now because it wasn't adopted. Yep. So yes, it will be corrected for the next report. Wonderful. All right then, Mr. Carpenter, you are up with status update on the long-range plan.
I'm sorry, Kathleen.
Oh, Mike.
I wanted to add something.
Mike, did you need something? I'm sorry.
Yeah, yes, I wanted to add something before we move on. There's a couple of things we need to consider here. First of all, this is a very difficult report to prepare, to review. It's 29 pages in front of us. And we've got to consider this in light of what we've adopted tonight. It's going to be done in a new way. It's going to be voted on in a different way. It's going to take, I'm really glad that Rosa Maria said that this is going out earlier than usual, because it's going to take individual board members even longer to do it under our new way of doing it. And secondly, and this is probably more important, we've discussed tonight, before this goes to a board, it's got to go to the board to vote on. It's got to go to a committee to sort through all of the responses and come up with a proposal to take to the board, a recommendation to take to the board. We haven't decided where this is going to go, and whatever committee gets that is going to have a really, really tough time. And we need to consider that too. And it's going to be tough. Doing this in a brand new way for perhaps the most difficult monitoring report there is. So people need to realize that. And we need to decide where this is going to go. It doesn't have to be tonight, I guess, but it's got to be decided soon. And there's certainly a potential that it's just going to take longer than anybody can imagine. And it's going to be very tough to approve it at the next board meeting.
Rich has
yeah, actually, that got me thinking, and this is just general for the board. Would it be helpful if we just had a field added to that survey form that actually we indicate how much time it took us to go through a particular monitoring report? Because I think having that data would help us just kind of one, know what to expect for future, and then two, maybe we can get some baselines as to, well, we've got this report that's 29 pages and it took us all like 2 to 3 to 4 hours to do, and then we can maybe make some decisions based around that.
Bless you. I would propose that we send that to committee, that question. Well, let's just talk about it now real quickly. Does anybody see any value in what Mr. Chang has proposed in terms of adding one more piece of information about how long did it take you to fill out the form? Or is it enough for us that when we're sitting down discussing the form at our meetings, that we can see that is a hearty amount of time and then have reflection at that time? Do we really need to go in and have actual time data? Does anybody support what Rich says, or are we good? Susan?
I know I would find it interesting, if not valuable, because it's the amount of time to what it is we're being asked to do, if there's a value to it. If it's incredibly important and we spend 3 hours, that's one thing, but if it's not arriving at something, but we've had to spend 3 hours, that may tell us something about how we may need to rewrite things. So I think it is a good exploration, just to understand what that element is. I could go either way, but I could see the value.
Okay. Yes, Rich?
Yeah, because I think one of the discussions we actually had at the board was the frequency of some of these monitoring reports. Like, should they actually be every other year or not? And I think this might help us maybe push some out that we go, it's probably something we can do every other year.
If I could suggest, then maybe we kick this to governance as a action item for us to discuss further, and then come back to everyone with regards to our thoughts and how to proceed forward. Okay, then. All right, are we all done now? Wonderful. No, this is good. We're exploring, we're new. It's just to be expected. So thank you for your patience, Mr. Carpenter. We'll hear your status update.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And we're getting to more fun stuff here. So thank you for bearing with us. I was negligent at the beginning of the meeting. I wanted to introduce some of the staff who are in attendance this evening. Troy Lundquist is with us online. Troy is our acting interim Deputy CEO of Operations. He stepped in for Forrest, who stepped in for Brian. So thank you to Troy. And with me here, who will be making part of this presentation, we have Ken Anderson, who is, I think, the official acting Deputy CEO for Planning this week. Gretchen Johnson, also with Planning, and Rosa Maria Nijuki, who you know, and they're going to be helping me with this presentation today. The long-range plan, the board approved this last year, I think in the summer before the millage, and we've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to sort of get this thing geared up. And get ready to come back to you and start talking about how we're doing it. We saw some of this, I think, to great effect, as Jesse mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, with Congresswoman Dingell at the Ypsilanti Transit Center earlier this week. This is a real-life manifestation of progress. And so we want to start talking about the long-range plan, bringing it back to you in bite-sized chunks, if you will, in a regular way to bring you updates, to let you know how this big project is beginning to unfold. So our agenda for this evening, and I don't think it'll take too long, really introduce a new part of the CEO report that I hope to make a standard thing, and that's an updates on how the long-range plan is going. And this may and we'll talk about that, and then have a preliminary discussion about setting priorities here at TheRide. And this is sort of what you might think of as the beginning of our budgeting process. We haven't formally started our annual budgeting process, but I want to lay some groundwork as this moves along. So, as the board may remember, although we do have some new members who may not have been part of these discussions, the board sets the direction for this organization through your written policies. These are the ends goals, the written policies, the ends policies, and also your executive limitations policies as well. Those policies get interpreted by the CEO, and we use our professional judgment to figure out how best to use the means, the operational elements at our control to achieve the goals that you've set out for us. The long-range plan is how we've consolidated many, I'd say 90% of the tactics towards achieving your ends have been rolled up into the long-range plan. So this is our sort of master blueprint for how we're moving forward to achieve your ends over a 25-year period. And as you can see, as a quick reminder, there's a lot in that document. It's a big document. We'll be happy to update everybody on it, but there's vehicles, there's technology, there's new services. There's so much infrastructure, capital projects. There's so much in there that it can be a little overwhelming. Quite frankly, there's quite a bit. So we want to begin to break it down for you into bite-sized chunks, discuss it in pieces, discuss the rollout, discuss the timeline. So what we're going to begin doing are regular status report updates. They're going to talk about the key projects, milestones, timelines. I'm thinking I will come in person every 2 months, particularly on this, but more frequently as needed. Some months it may just be a written part of the CEO report. Other times we may have big things to discuss and we may spend a lot more time on a particular project. We're going to start using project management tools like Gantt charts, which is one of the colorful printouts you have at your desk. We haven't used a whole lot of those with you in the past, but these are tools that staff use very frequently. And then, just as a broad phase, we're in a lot of startup discussions right now. We have a lot of studies going on. The Ypsilanti Transit Center is about to move into sort of a pre-design phase of its study, so it's getting more serious. But other things are at different places in the queue. So we'll talk about that as well. But after we get into 2025, my hope is to have at least one construction project going at any one time. So that's a pretty ambitious thing for an organization that hasn't built anything since the mid-90s. And we have to stand up a whole construction department in effect. So that's kind of where we're headed. So what we're going to do now, my colleagues are going to help me with some sort of speed dating rapid fire updates. We're going to provide you with a high-level overview of our organization and timeline for this. Then we're going to touch upon the Ypsilanti Transit Center, millage services, the promises we made last August, and then I'm going to follow it up with a little bit about propulsion. I will ask that we hold our questions until the end, because after propulsion, I'll have a few more things to say about setting priorities, and I think then after that would be a great time to stop and have a discussion and conversations. With that, I would like to welcome Rosa Maria up to the stage.
Thank you, Matt. So the slide in front of you is very busy, and I am just going to ask you to get to the Gantt chart in front of you. For today, I'm just going to orient you to the Gantt chart. We're not going to go to the details of the projects, the timelines, and that's why the one that's showing there is truncated. So to begin with, as you can see, there's numbers. That will be helpful when we start talking about the projects. That way we can be able to orient ourselves to which project we're talking about. And then there is the projects that we have. We've separated, or we've categorized this into 3 main categories. So there's the projects that will be implementing the long-range plan, there's the climate change initiatives, and then there is other major projects. There is a lot of projects within the organizations, so we're just focusing on the major ones for now in this Gantt chart. And then on the second set of columns, you'll see a lot of X's. We're trying to see how each of these projects impacts ends. And as you can see, most of the projects within the long-range plan do impact a couple of ends. So there's growing ridership, social equity, environmental sustainability, economic impact, customer satisfaction, and goodwill. The X's that are in bold show that that particular project impacts end or ends. That particular end that's in that column at a higher magnitude than the X's are lowercase and small. So that's just helping us know the magnitude. And I can provide more information should you need more clarification on that. And then moving on to the timeline, where it's shaded, those are the areas where we'll be working on the projects. I'd like to just note the letters that are in the timeline. There is C, mainly on the implementing the long-range plan. That shows when we will be commissioning that particular project. So, for example, for project number 8, the new bus garage, it should be constructed and completed by 2028, and we should be able to get our new fleet and have that running. We also have S, which stands for studies. And as you can see, after S, it's followed by next steps TBD. And this is because once we have the studies, we'll get recommendations from those studies. The timeline will be determined after those studies are completed. So that's TBD for now. We're also trying to not lose track of what's happening internally as well as externally. So we have Title VI reviews, which is marked FR, which is federal review. We also have the triennial review. So we want to make sure that as we're working, we're also tracking what's happening internally as well as what's happening externally. I'd like to just end my part by saying these timelines are subject to change due to funding and so many other moving parts. And with that, I'm going to welcome Gretchen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa Maria. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick update on the Ypsilanti Transit Center. I think a project that we're all very excited about, and kind of one of my big priorities at the moment. So the project will be an entirely new, larger facility in the city of Ypsilanti. The previous work that we've done on it in 2017 to 2018 did go through some of the different site selection process and really identified the existing site as a preferred alternative. So that's where we are right now, which means that the old terminal will be demolished. So the facility will be entirely new and expanded. Right now, our estimates, which I think are actually 2021 dollars, are that the project will be 18 to 20 million for capital, and that's from planning through construction and opening. However, on the flip side, the operating costs, what we've looked at so far is that any additional operating costs above what we have today are negligible. So, going forward, we have to have many, many discussions with the city of Ypsi, property owners, of course, riders, customers, community members, and all the various stages of planning will include, multiple rounds of public engagement that we plan to, really take that in and make sure that the project, works for us, but also works for the community. Just to quickly go through some of the big benefits of the project, I think everyone can kind of knows a lot of these, but the big one is just expansion. Right now, it's really reached the end of its useful life, both in just terms of age, it's 30 years old now, but also in terms of the amount of space for passengers, drivers, buses, pretty much across the board. It's just too small. So we have big plans to expand, of course, with the long-range plan and the millage services. And so really we're looking at trying to really modernize, upgrade the facility, and expand it quite a bit, and expand the number of bays for buses. To quickly kind of go through some of the funding and timeline, we are, of course, using a mix of local, state, and funding sources. Huge boost this week with the $7 million earmark from Representative Dingell. So that's for the construction, with the $300,000 last year that we received from Senator Peters for the planning. And from here, we'll have a mix to fund the rest. And then, so planning is getting underway to update some of that previous work and really go into some preliminary design to make sure we have everything set up well for going right into environmental study. That'll take a lot, but we hope to move through that pretty quickly through 2025 or so, with the detailed design and engineering starting around that time, and hoping for construction in 2026 through 2027. So then the grand opening would be in 2027. So I appreciate the opportunity to answer any questions after everyone else is done. Ken?
Hi, everybody. So, as you remember, in last August, voters passed a millage that authorized our agency to for 5 years of increased funding to support several new millage services that we've been talking about as part of our long-range plan. Think of these services that I'm going to talk about as kind of the upper left-hand part of the Gantt chart that you have for the first couple of years. These are those services. So, services that we're talking about are, number one, Ann Arbor to Ypsilanti Express Service. This would be bus service that's expected to cut the travel times between Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti about a third compared to what Route 4 operates right now. Second one is longer hours of operation across the entire system. This means that all of our routes are going to start earlier, they're going to end a little bit later, and then we're going to standardize those start and end times amongst all the routes. So we won't have ones that, start at 6 and the next one starts at 7. The third one is increased weekend frequency across the entire system. So that means on Saturdays and Sundays, every route is going to be operating every 30 minutes. The fourth will be expanded overnight service for Ypsilanti City and Ypsilanti Township. We're currently undertaking a study to determine what the best mode of operation is going to be for that. We'll know probably in a few months. And then the fifth is customer service representatives at the Ypsilanti Transit Center. There are going to be 2 additional reps that will be able to provide fare sales, they'll answer customer questions, they'll take photographs, and they'll provide all the services that currently are provided at the Blake Transit Center and at the main office down on Industrial. So, the new funding for these services is going to arrive in July 2024, which means that we'll be able to implement all the services described here in August 2024. Now, I want to make 2 exceptions to that. The first one is the customer service reps that we just talked about. They are expected to come online after they get through their training and all of that stuff. They're expected to join us in September of this year. We also have the opportunity, and I'm going to put a big caveat on this at the end, we have an opportunity due to some grant funding that we received from SEMCOG to fund the express bus service for, I think it's the first 3 years of its operations. So we're currently exploring the possibility of moving the timeline up on that to as early as January of 2024. The caveat is we have to make sure that the internal operations can accommodate this, our planning processes can accommodate this, and that we meet all regulatory processes. So thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Matt.
Thanks, Ken. In addition to the services, another element of the long-range plan that was a little less clear than what Ken had was the idea of climate change and particularly propulsion system changes. So a little bit of movement here. Obviously, it was a board priority. We talked about it last fall. We had a big discussion. Those informations are still moving forward. I will be coming to you with an update and a recommendation next month. But we've had some success moving forward and just sort of fleshing out the timelines and the processes. We had a very good meeting with City of Ann Arbor staff today. That was important because we have some key partners in Ann Arbor where our building is located. We have, no matter which technology we pick, for example, we're going to make some modifications to our building. That's going to require some level of zoning change or approval or review by the Planning Commission. We found out today that that could be a 3 to 5 month exercise. So we have to build, it's good to know that now so we can build that into our timelines and processes. We also spoke to the fire chief, and it sounds like he has very similar perspectives as we do to the pros and cons of some of these technologies. And just a bit of a preview to what I'll tell you next month. I think we have an opportunity in May of 2024 to put in a really amazing grant application to the Low-No program. We have a lot of work to do between now and then, selecting a technology, going through this planning process, resolving fire and emergency issues, among other things. So next month I'll be laying out a bit more of a timeline for that. Study of our remaining fleet. Buses are, of course, the vast bulk of what we do, but we do have other vehicles, the paratransit fleets, and our staff cars in particular. We had, and you wouldn't know this because you haven't seen this Gantt chart before, but if you look down on lines 26, 27, and 28, the green ones, because the environment, right, so they're green, these are the areas where we've sort of put the big projects in this space. And there's 3 broad areas we're looking to: the buses, the facilities, and all the other vehicles that we have. Line 28 is a study of the support fleet and the TheRide vehicles and the other things. In the last version of this study was programmed for 2026. We're exploring, and I'm pretty sure we can accelerate that study to the second half of this year. So sometimes pieces on this Gantt chart can move around because of funding availability, because bandwidth opened up in a couple of spaces. So this is one where we can accelerate that a little bit. And then finally, we have another grant opportunity, the same grant we won that Ken mentioned, and Gretchen didn't, you know, we're the people who brought that money in, so full credit to them. We have an opportunity to apply for that again. It's the carbon reduction program through SEMCOG. We've learned a lot more. This round's going to be different. But we think we have an opportunity to begin putting our toe into, again, the electric propulsion side of things and looking at our support vehicles. We have a number of minivans that are used by drivers for shuttling back and forth to various places around the service area. Someone, you know, finishes their bus route and they need to be picked up and taken back to their back to base. Those sorts of things. We think we might have an opportunity to put in a grant application to begin the electrification of some of the minivans. So a much smaller yield thing than the bus study, but important nonetheless, and perhaps a tangible demonstration of moving forward on those projects. So with that, that sort of wraps up our speed dating long-range plan status report. As I said before, we'll try to keep you up to date with key projects, milestones, timelines. When big things happen, we'll let you know one way or the other. Every 2 months or as needed. Sometimes it may be more intensive. Other times it may be a couple months. We haven't heard much. That will be normal. And as Rosa said with her part of the Gantt chart, we have our pieces. They're getting organized. We know some things are going to change, like this study of the support fleet already moved up. Some things, you know, just to make sure everybody understands, these things never unfold exactly as planned. So we'll keep you up to date with how things evolve. So with that, I'd like to move into the subject of priorities, because I think it's relevant to this work, if that's okay. So yes, setting priorities and alignment. Clear priorities, expectations, knowing your expectations, that we're all clear about this is so important to being able to execute things long term. So really, we're going to start our budgeting process in a couple months. We haven't even gotten to that point. I'm just laying some groundwork here, but I cannot emphasize how important it is for us as staff that we're clear on your expectations as a board, because that's how we build the budgets that come forward. So we have plenty of time, but we do need to use that time wisely. Good execution, as I mentioned, really starts with these clear priorities. And I think it's important for us to sort of note that we as an organization are starting kind of a new stage of our life at this point. And there's sort of before the long-range plan and after the long-range plan. And we're moving from a time when we were an organization that talked about what we ought to do, and that was most of our focus, to our focus is shifting increasingly to implementing what we've already committed to do. So we're becoming a whole lot more on the execution side of things. I want to put that in context. We're a $50 million annual operation with just under 300 staff. Right now, most of those people are already permanently dedicated to delivering bus services every day. We are an operating agency. That is what most of our resources go to. It's really, at best, 10 people on staff at any given time who are really working on change initiatives. So we don't have a huge bench of people to pull from there. And that's why understanding the priorities is so important. And as we begin to pivot to delivering what we have agreed to do, those commitments that Ken, for example, talked about with the new services, those have to be some of the first things we've done because we've publicly promised to do that. So the long-range plan is a critical part of this because It's the blueprint for what we're going to do. I know sometimes big plans from agencies sit on shelves, and I call those sorts of like paperweight plans, because that's really all they end up doing. Sometimes they're important because they sort of signal aspirations or virtues that communities hold dear, but they don't actually work as a blueprint. I need to emphasize to you as the board that we as staff see the long-range plan as a blueprint. It is a to-do list. It was intentionally crafted as these are the priorities, these are the projects, these are how they advance the board's ends. This is what staff are to execute. So when you see me with Gantt charts and when I'm talking about aligning resources and staff to key projects, it's all in the service of executing that broader vision. Now this pivot requires just some things we need to be mindful of as we go forward. As we're finding out with the Ypsilanti Transit Center, we had a great milestone today. We're 5 years out from opening. We've already been working on it for at least 5 years. The projects that we handle, particularly on the construction and the capital side, are multi-year projects, and that require us to maintain focus and discipline from start to end. A lot of our projects are things that take a while to execute, so we just have to sort of keep our eye on the ball during that period. That's where the priorities become very important. If we keep changing our minds and shifting focus and shifting priorities, we may never actually move forward in achieving the overall goals or the projects that we want. So focus and discipline are important. Alignment of limited resources, primarily staff, organizational capacity, and money. We only have so much of it. So I will increasingly be orienting the staff and the money we have towards executing the vision of the long-range plan and the priorities that are in there. This does force me to look at priorities, and how we organize those priorities go forward, I think, is an important thing for us all to just be clear about. And the Gantt chart shows you not the priority so much as the sequence. Some things have to happen in a certain order. The cart has to come after the horse. But nevertheless, the priorities are important. Priorities are also important because they imply trade-offs and tough choices. Not everything can be our number one priority. If everything's our number one priority, we haven't done our job of prioritizing anything. Sometimes it feels like a loss to be the second priority, but what I hope we can demonstrate with some of these updates is that we're actually moving forward on pretty much all fronts. Every end priority is getting some love, is getting some element of resources and time and attention from the agency, and we're moving all the balls up the field. We may not be able to move every ball as fast as every single person wishes, but we've got to sort of take a balanced approach comprehensively and move them all forward in a sort of comprehensive manner. But there are trade-offs, and we need to be upfront with each other about that. The alignment that comes from board direction drives our budgeting process, and that brings me to the first step of that. All of you have another document at your chair called our business plan. This is the current year business plan. You're going to see the next version of this in a couple of months, so this is old, but I think I wanted you to have it so you could have a flip through it and familiarize yourself with what this first step of our budgeting process is going to look like. This is the front half of the budget. This is the strategic planning part of the budget. This is where we take the big discussions that happen that every organization needs to suss out. What are we doing? What are we working on? What are our priorities? We do that in the business planning process. So as you go forward, you're going to see the next version of this begin to manifest to the 10-year capital plan, the 10-year operating plan, all based on the long-range plan direction. So the long-range plan, which is coming from your ends drive the plan, your plan drives our annual budgets, starting with this. We like to have consensus on this first thing in our budgeting process so that we've all talked about it before Dina starts the hard, heavy lifting of putting the numbers in the budget. I like to make her job easier by sort of settling the big questions before we start crunching numbers. Again, if we're going to have disagreements about priorities or things we need to talk about, I'd rather do that before she's already spent a lot of time building impressive spreadsheets if she has to throw them away. And then, as I'm about to say, the board has a lot of flexibility. You guys have the steering wheel on this. I'm going to go through that in a moment. But we have to respect that TheRide, increasingly, as we make this pivot, is going to also need certainty. We need your guidance. We need your wisdom. but we also need some consistency. If we have a 10-year plan to bring a terminal in, we can't change our minds every few years. So setting priorities, just a quick reminder of how this is done here. So the board controls and directs the organization through your written policies as per policy governance, a lot of what we talked about today. It's your written policies that we really look to when we interpret things, when we make decisions about which should come first. I frequently ask staff, well, what do the policies say? Let's go back to that. Those are our marching orders. You have a lot of options with how you write your policies. You can add new policies. You can reword existing policies. You can delete certain things, particularly the ends policies, but also the executive limitations. The board in the past has broached the idea of ranking your ends. They're not ranked right now, which kind of leaves it to me and the staff to figure out the best way to move them all down the field. Those are things that you can do as a board. That's your steering wheel to tell me what the priorities ought to be. The important part about that exercise is that you speak with one voice as a board. I can't possibly negotiate 10 different sets of priorities. I need you to send me one signal about what's important, and then I can align the organization to achieve that. You have tools like your annual plan of work and your education, and thank you for approving those today. We can get started on some of those things. We also have the business planning process. That's more my responsibility, but I am intentionally asking you, here's what I think we're doing next year. Here's what I think the budget's going to include. Tell me what you think about that. I'd love to hear earlier. I love it when you guys are clear about your expectations, because then I know what you want to see, and it's no surprise 4 months later. But we also have to, again, sort of remember, both on the staff side and on the board, too many changes, too many shifts in direction can compromise our ability to execute some of these bigger projects. And as the board gives direction to staff, we make technical recommendations. I'll make a recommendation to you about propulsion technology. The long-range plan was a recommendation. The budgets are recommendations. Ultimately, it'll be up to you in many of those cases to actually decide. So next steps, just to draw us to a close, we are beginning to organize, as you can see in the Gantt chart and with the presentation today, we're beginning to organize around your approved directions. They really all come back to the long-range plan. We haven't talked much about the long-range plan since it was approved, so I wanted to bring it back and put it in front of us. Business planning, the precursor to the budget, that's probably going to begin in a couple months around March. You can expect to see an updated version of this document. I really would encourage you to take a quick spin through this. There's SWOT analyses in here. There's pestle analyses in here. There's, the back page is my favorite. It's just a checklist of our thinking. When I tell you that we use professional judgment to vet projects, what does that mean? We've actually broken it down. It's not a mystery. It's not a black box. We run them through questions like these to figure out how to balance all the competing interests. So you can watch for that around March, and I'll bring that to you for your feedback. And of course, you as a board, through your policies, can change the direction of the organization at any time that you wish. That's up to you. And now with your plan of work, I think we have some ideas of where we're going in the near future. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you so much for your time. I know it's late. I wanted to give you just a taste of things to come and an update of the long-range plan. At this point, me and my team are happy to answer any questions you might have had about any of the updates or the larger process that's going to unfold before long.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter, and everyone who provided such wonderful analysis for us. Love the Gantt chart, Rosa Maria. This is fabulous. I'm going to open it up to the board for any questions or discussion for anyone on the team there. Go ahead, Mr. Allen.
With regards to state funding, in particular the $7 million, are there any stipulations both on the availability and or the expiration of those funds?
Yeah, good question. So the $7 million are federal funds. They don't call them earmarks anymore. That's old words. Community funding request is how DC likes to refer to these now. We're still learning. Earmarks or funding requests are just back after a 10-year hiatus, and the rules are a little rusty. Congresswoman Dingell corrected me on a couple of things. I thought it was a reimbursement program. Apparently, it's a direct deposit. We're just going to get $7 million, which I hadn't realized, so I've got to make sure we have a capital reserve to put that in that's dedicated to the YTC, because that's an earmarked, legally defined purpose, so the stipulation there. I'm not sure about an expiration date. In the past, earmarks did not have expiration dates. They sat on the books until used or till Congress clawed the money back, and it could be decades. As of 5 years ago, there was still Great Recession earmarks that hadn't been used in Dearborn. I knew that, so if it can hang out that long, I'm not sure they expire per se. But as all federal funds do, they come with a host of strings attached in terms of complying with all manner of federal regulatory things. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the National Environmental Protection Act. All of these things create a number of requirements that we must comply with if we are to use this money. Gretchen's planning process, for example, part of the reason it's going to take 2 years plus is we have to check all those boxes to prove to the Fed's satisfaction, the FTA, that we're using federal money correctly. The big benefit of these funding requests that we didn't have to go through a competitive process. It's just a direct thing that Congresswoman Dingell is bringing to Ypsilanti. The benefit there is if we had to compete with all the other transit agencies, we might have lost. We might have lost for 3 or 4 years in a row before we got the money. This really fast tracks the whole thing. I hope that answers your question.
Do we have any other questions? Rich?
First off, thank you. I actually really appreciated the speed dating updates. I found it extremely helpful. One just general request. I love the Gantt chart. I mean, from the industry I come in, this is like talking my language. My half-century-year-old eyes, though, have a little bit of issue with the X differentiation. And so just a suggestion is maybe like if the font allows it, just like a capital M for major and a small m for minor. Because some of these I really had a hard time just differentiating which one was actually bold and capital and not. The general question I had, though, is probably more for Matt, because you made a statement about how you have a staff of around 300, and in reality, only 10 of those can actually focus on the LRP is the way I kind of interpreted that. Is that a concern that we should be aware of? Because I mean, I appreciate and I'm glad that the staff is focused on the operational piece, because that is what they should be doing. But I mean, for the success of the LRP, what do we as a board, what can we do to help? I mean, should we consider that you will be potentially sending us a request for more staff to help out with this? I don't know. So.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and you know, I'm ballparking in the staffing capacity side of things. Gretchen, for example, has a lot of things that she does every day that are directly related to the Ypsi Transit Center. But she also has stuff that she does every day that's just keeping the wheels on the bus and keeping things going. Ken's the same way. We already have had, I think, some success in adding staff. For the first 5 or 6 years I was here, we were kind of grappling with a financial shortfall that really caused us to pull in our horns. It was very difficult for me to advise us to take on more work because it would just be accentuating our financial challenges. The millage really resolved that. It did add several staff in a couple of key places. You'll remember, I think there was like 9 staff that were built into that. So we already kind of have added it. If we need more, that'll come through the budget process. I do have some latitude within the existing budget envelope if needed to add FTEs in certain places. We're also beginning to reorient the staff, as I said, align them to the goals. So we've spoken here about our advocacy agenda, our legislative agenda. And I mentioned there that I'm looking forward to bringing on our manager of public affairs as the person who's going to be staffing that. So our first round of recruitment for that last year was not successful. It's out again. So we're changing job descriptions to refocus staff on the things that are important. That person's going to be working with you, among others, to sort of hash out who are we talking to and what are we talking to them about. If we need more resources, I'll let you know, and we'll see how we can make that happen. And one of the big challenges we have right now is simply being able to recruit the quality of people we already have. It's a tight labor market, and finding people who know how to build bus terminals and navigate all the federal rules pertaining to this is not easy. It's a tight It's not as easy to find those sorts of folks in the Midwest in particular.
Susan?
Again, I want to add to everyone else's thanks. This was a great presentation. Thank you. It's helpful to put all the pieces together. A question for you, Matt. We have a newly formed committee where we're going to be meeting with our owners. And a question for you, at least initially, we're thinking about what questions we ask them to make sure we're meeting their needs and how they interpret our work. Can staff begin to formulate policy level issues that we might bring to them for discussion at a policy level? A lot of the work you're doing right now is at a technical level. As we look to some very significant service changes, there will likely be policy level issues. I mean, just think Washtenaw right now is a parking lot. We're going to have policy level discussions with the cities and all the municipalities along Washtenaw. If staff could begin to think about where we play a role in the processes, because again, policy to policy is a very different discussion than at the technical staff to staff level. I welcome that opportunity to bring this to them, to share with them why we think these issues are important and we'd like to get them on our side. Again, so it's a two-way dialogue, not just our listening, but also our bringing policy level issues to their attention. So if you could just begin to think about it, we're going to begin work. There's a lot of work ahead of us, so there's time. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I think there are some opportunities there as you are going to listen to their values and use those to help give me the direction that you feel we should have. I think there are going to be specific projects that we're going to want to speak to them about, and then, and I may be off base here, but in terms of policy things, bus lanes is one of the first things when you said that sort of came to my mind, particularly in downtown Ann Arbor. It's a bus lane, the concern is it's great for the service, bypass congestion, more reliable, faster service. There's no question it builds ridership, checks a lot of boxes. I'm looking, I'm sure it's on here. I just can't find it at the moment. It's not the money that worries me there, it's the political will and the authorization to get rid of curb parking, which to me is the policy issue on their end. That's the kind of thing, as Rich has mentioned this, when you guys are going to talk to them about ownership linkage, and we want to ask for their help on something, that's a great example. We'll find more. Thank you for the heads up. We'll find more. But that's the kind of thing in an advocacy agenda I think would be very front and center, because we could probably pay for it, but it's the political impact of removing the on-street parking that really we need our partners to buy into. So that's one example. That's the first one that came to the top of my mind.
Any other questions? Simi?
Yeah, Matt, on the terms on grants, the subject of grants, I had asked last week about the potential for a smaller grant in 2023 to kick us off. It sounds like we're thinking 2024, the big proposal. I'm just wondering what the thought was there. I know there were potentially some like requirements that we just weren't able to fulfill.
Yeah, I think we're talking about the bus propulsion proposal. Yeah. So that's kind of the big enchilada. That's a big all at once sort of thing. The sequence of approvals that I need to ask you for creates a bit of a challenge. I don't want to put the cart before the horse and start buying a set of buses that you haven't fully approved as a board. That's awkward. There's also, on the federal level, they require a transition plan before they'll award any of these grants. And the transition plan, as I understand it, is a board-approved document of basically our intentions to convert to a zero-emissions fleet. We can have a really long timeline. We can fudge a lot in terms of as funding becomes available. But we can't win any money without having the transition plan written. So I don't know how I'm not sure I can give them like a mini transition plan. I'm still looking into that. I think that they want it all and they want the big commitment. So still looking into that one for you. But I think there's a roadblock with the transition plan requirement.
And with the SEMCOG's carbon reduction plan, I took a look at that for my work with the city, and we saw it as pretty flexible, like, and so just curious how the auxiliary fleet was chosen as a focus of that grant versus like potential other infrastructure work, upgrading
Sure.
the electrical work room.
Gretchen, you want to join me? Come on up. So Gretchen's been looking into this plan. We've had a number of sort of all key staff meetings on this, and Gretchen's been learning more and more about the grant. And she can correct me if I'm wrong. The carbon reduction program is federal money flowing through SEMCOG. They're awarding it. Gretchen and Dina were very successful last year, as Ken mentioned, in getting 2.1 million. It's a small grant. Good on her. To fund the express bus operations. That was a strictly operating budget thing. That's really odd. Usually federal grants are never operating, they're always capital. So that we got operating dollars is a testament to good work on this end. The rules are changing. As Gretchen is advising me, one of the big changes is, although there is still $9 million available for a year, it's not just transit agencies anymore. They're opening it up to road groups too. And this covers all of Southeast Michigan. So instead of 4 applicants competing for $9 million, there's probably like 50 or more groups. And it may be, cities might be part of it. It does seem to be transportation related. But they've also said some things to her that suggest they kind of see it as, hey, you guys got money last year. Let other people dip their beaks this time. So the likelihood that we're going to get a much smaller amount of money is a factor. We're trying to tailor a project to win the grant. We're trying to find something that makes sense. The support fleet is something we completely control. We don't need to have any other partner to sort of deal with. The deadline is February 10, so it's very rapidly approaching. It's something we can completely control. We know how to pay the operating costs of it. It might have some tack-on benefits of if we get them to pay for replacing vehicles we were going to replace anyway, it may free up other capital dollars in our budget that can be used for other things. So it seems to check a lot of boxes. So that's we did discuss the possibility for a couple of other things. Electrifying park and ride lots was one thing we broached. Express bus service up US 23. But a lot of those other ones had ongoing operating costs that would continue past the expiration of the grant. And that's a bit of a cliff for us, because if we commit ourselves to an ongoing operating cost and then the money runs out, what am I cutting in order to keep that going? So the capital side makes it a lot easier because it's done, and we're kind of finished with it. So that's the thinking behind that. And Gretchen, anything you want to add in terms of the strategy behind our discussions there?
I'll just add one quick thing. Part of it was too just trying to find a project that we feel is sort of, I don't know if you've looked at the application, but it's a pretty flexible application, like you said, and they don't need a whole lot of detail. But in my conversations with SEMCOG, they still really want to make sure that, this is money that's going to be going towards a viable project that's not just something that people kind of pulled out of their back pocket, So we feel that we have that ready enough with the support vehicles that we can put in a really good competitive application. And they are capped at $1.5 million this time. Now you can put in multiple applications, so I guess you could put in for multiple $1.5 dollar applications. But we felt like something like this would kind of toe that line of where we're ready. We have the project far enough along that we can put in a competitive application, but that was small enough that, and also far out enough that transit, they're not really going to consider transit too heavily in 2024. So something that was just really kind of a good competitive application in 2025 or 2026.
It also allows us to, if we can lock in the implementation money for 2025, we can spend the time between now and then sorting out how are we actually going to do it? Because there's a lot of things just in the management of the batteries themselves on these equipment that we don't know. We're not familiar with this. This is a great way for to put us our little toe in it and learn how to use battery-driven equipment. I had a really good meeting with the mechanics yesterday, and they were surprisingly supportive.
Did you have anything else, Simi? Jesse?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. Again, I was getting excited listening to the plan. It's really great to hear that tone change that you referred to, like that, you know, this is no longer a dream, this is now a plan. But there were a couple of things that we talked about that I wasn't sure where they fit in the LRP implementation. One was the bus stop project, that Rosa you referred to earlier, wanting to improve bus stops throughout, making sure that there were sidewalks to them, make sure they have shelters. I wasn't seeing where that fell in this.
You want to take a swing at it?
So in general, we have a lot of ongoing projects, and when we first started the first iteration of this Gantt chart, we put all the projects here, but we had to kind of have a focus. So this Gantt chart really looks on projects that are focused on the LRP, climate change initiatives, and other major projects. The bus stop improvements is something that's in the ends report, and so that project is only appearing there. So this shows the major projects, but we still have so many other ongoing projects. I don't know if that answers your question.
I would add essentially it exists as just another part of our operating budget. It's just buried in there with dozens of other important but not Gantt chart important level projects. So it's there, it still exists, it's still getting done. It's just when we do something that on the Gantt chart produces a line that never ends, like we're going to be working on that for 10 years, or it literally never ends, like internal improvements never end. We had to make a decision about what do we put on the Gantt chart and what not goes on the Gantt chart, because it would just be enormous. So a lot of ongoing routine things, and bus stops in our mind are a routine every year, we got to do this sort of thing. They just didn't rise to a level of importance to show up on the Gantt chart. They are important, I don't want to diminish them, but they're going on in the background. We didn't think they were needed to on this chart.
Okay. I guess I was just a little bit surprised about that, because you've talked about like the difficulty in that, you know, upgrading a bus stop is not just putting down a slab and a shelter. It actually involves a lot of cooperation with the municipality, you know, because of the sidewalks issue. To me, that kind of seems pretty analogous with bus lanes. You know, that requires a lot of cooperation. It's not one of those things that we can just do. You know, it's not a question of money. There's a lot of other things that kind of go into it. So I guess I did kind of think that that was a larger project. So I don't know, that as we talk about priorities, that might be something that we'll talk about in a future conversation.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. If it doesn't show up on the Gantt chart, that doesn't mean it's not getting done. It just means it's not showing up on this Gantt chart. This is the major stuff that's going to require change. And what I explained, what I was working with on Rosa was I want to see the change initiatives. We've already made the decision to make all the bus stops accessible. That decision is in the past. It's just execution at this point. Yeah, it's not easy getting the permits, and there's all sorts of headaches on just the day-to-day operations. But that's a workable thing that I can delegate to staff, and it just ticks over, as opposed to bus lanes where there's conversations with councils that are going to happen before that occurs. That's a heavier lift, a bigger change. That's why that sort of thing would probably want to show up on this Gantt chart, because it's going to consume staff time, possibly senior level staff time to make the change. But once the change is made and it becomes an operational routine thing, then it's just background work. and we just do it every day. There's a lot of intensive efforts that don't show up on this Gantt chart that kind of on the line there. But just to assure you, just because it's not here doesn't mean it's not getting done.
I think the idea that sidewalks don't involve conversations with council doesn't mesh with the news reports that I read. Maybe you're seeing some different meetings than I am. The other question I had to do with a route redesign, which was alluded to in the long-range plan. I asked about it several times, and the consultant said that's just something that will happen as part of this project. And they didn't want to identify like when specifically that would happen, but I still am having a bit of an issue with that if there's the idea that, so I guess I want to say, has that been addressed? I noticed that there was a difference in the way that you talked about frequency with going to the 30-minute frequencies versus line 23, you actually talk about a high-frequency network. Is that actually talking about a network redesign, or is that just an incidental?
Ken, do you know
change of
where,
verbiage?
sort of on the Gantt chart, the LRP concept of network redesign? I thought it was sort of buried in with some of these projects, like the high-frequency network, but maybe you, and come on up here so the microphone can hear you.
So the the 30-minute frequency stuff that I brought up a little while ago, that's just going to apply to the existing network for the next several years. Once we get through planning, I think starting in around 2024, 2025, that's when we're going to start the planning efforts for more of the redesign of the network. So a lot of the bigger projects we're kind of breaking this out into 5-year chunks in my department as we're looking through it, and the first 5-year chunk that we're looking at right now is the millage stuff, and then some of the capital projects, and then starting the planning for the next 5-year chunk. And so a lot of the larger redesign stuff will take place in that second 5 years and then pushing out into the future after that.
Thank you.
It's a good question, though, in terms of whether or not we should represent that on the Gantt chart as a particular project. It might clarify things. Oh, absolutely, please.
I helped Rosa put this together from the long-range plan, so I just wanted to add a couple things. Line 5 with the accessibility improvements, that's where you might see some of the bus stop improvements. The long-range plan didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but I did have to collapse some of those projects to fit it in here, and accessibility. And with the demand response and fixed route integration, that's where you'll see at least some of the bus stops. And then, as Ken mentioned, a lot of that work in terms of the network redesign is not necessarily explicitly called out, and the stuff we're doing now is for the existing network, but you'll kind of see things like the priority service, with those being kind of a different, I call it a different kind of service. That's where a lot of those, then we'll take a look at the kind of the holistic network then and do, changes to the routes as we build up that priority service, working towards that high frequency network. The more local service will kind of change along with those priority services. The long range plan didn't go into a whole lot of detail, so we have a lot of leverage of when that all happens. But we have these 5-year chunks with that priority service and high frequency network kind of evolving all along throughout those.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I think just as the YTC has outgrown its usefulness, I think there's some of our routes have also outgrown their usefulness. Things have changed. You and I had a conversation. We've got ridership that we have stops that are not utilized to the degree that the areas that they serve are utilized. We've been talking about Rec Park in Ypsilanti. It's a very heavily used park, especially in the summer months. There's things happening there continually. And yet our ridership numbers show only 2 boardings at that stop, which to me indicates an issue with the route. So I think there are probably other opportunities there, and I want to make sure that that is something that we're looking at, that we're not just building on an old network.
That's a fair comment, and actually sort of bleeds into sort of other ways that the long-range plan manifests. They don't all show up in the Gantt chart, but one of the things that's in the new job description for the manager of public affairs is kind of maybe we're on the same wavelength, Jesse. I don't think we sell what we already do well enough. Like if you look at a lot of our marketing material, it's sort of general information. It's not what I would call retail advertising. We're not trying to use it to lure people on. We're not looking for major events or popular destinations in local communities and digging into how do we get those people on the bus. We haven't really had the staff to do with that. So in our budget, in our plans, we do, but finding the leader that I need to help me sort of give the horsepower to that is kind of where we are at. So in building ridership, there's a couple things. I think we're on the same page there, whether it's marketing and advertising or updating the services. I think it will all be addressed.
Lots of good comments from our board. Go board. Do we have any other questions?
I have one last thing I'd like to point out about the Gantt chart. And oh, good, Susan's back, if I might, because I know the time is late. How many of you have heard the phrase critical path? So some things you got to get done, and if you work your way backwards from the outcome you want, you find that there's some things that matter, but then there's a couple things that are critical, and a critical pathway begins to reemerge. A while ago, Susan asked us, what are you doing to build ridership? And I feel like there's more discussions that I'd love to have and share with you. A lot of that's embedded in the long-range plan. That was your number one ends goal. The long-range plan was geared towards that, but I want to give you just an idea of how that manifests in this Gantt chart and the sequencing and the prioritization of the work that we bring to you. What builds ridership? Everything we know and read and hear about bus services and public transportation, what builds ridership the most effectively is the frequency of the service. Travel time matters, cleanliness matters, the politeness of the driver matters, all these things matter, but the thing that matters most is the frequency. If it's coming every hour, that's not very good. Every 10 minutes, that's great. Much more likely to build ridership because you can attract people out of their car because of the convenience of a highly frequent service. And if we segment our market, we have a large number of people in the community who need to rely on us, and we want to serve them. That's our social mission. We're never going to stop doing that, but we can't grow that pie very much. If you think about it from a retail marketing perspective, that market segment is what it is, and it's not going to grow very fast. The best area for us to grow ridership is in what is sometimes called discretionary riders, people who have other options. What's the number one thing to do that? It's the frequency of the service. Jesse and I have discussed our new buses, the Novas that are out there, and the padded seats. I would point to that as another example of the sort of things we're doing to try to convert ourselves into a service that's attractive for that more discretionary market. But if we accept that the frequency of the service is the number one thing we need to do to meet your goal of increasing ridership, and that's how we do better on social things, on labor mobility things, on environmental things, that's how we get there, then I can work back. What does it take to increase the frequency? Well, to increase the frequency of the services, I need more buses. But I have a garage that's full. I can't buy the buses until I have a garage to put them in. I can't do the BRT work until I have a place to put those buses. So when you work back, the critical path is if we're getting to ridership, we need to build a garage first so that we can expand our fleet, so that we can increase the frequency of service. That's the critical path that runs through the big, heavy capital investments buried in this Gantt chart. That's the one you're going to see in the capital budgets and plans. The unfortunate thing is that a garage is not sexy. It's not an exciting project. I'll do my best to make it exciting, but it's not a passenger facility. But it's a big fixed asset. You can't operate without it. Everybody needs a boiler room. It just has to happen. So we've got to move through that big, happy capital investment until we can get to the fun stuff of expanding the fleet and increasing the frequency of service. That's the critical path from a capital perspective. It will consume a lot of our time, but it's also, back to Susan's question from months ago, what's the big thing you're doing to increase ridership? That's embedded in here. There are lots of other things. I had mentioned updating the ride guide, which in retrospect was a dumb example because it is a low yield thing. I don't want to overblow that. But that's a quality of service thing that we also are doing. It's not on the Gantt chart, but the whole ride guide's getting redone. So there are a lot of balls moving. There's a lot of things being rolled up various hills. When we're happy with these updates, we'll begin to bring you more of these sort of tactical details. And this has been a good conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it. You earned it after that long philosophical discussion about board governance. So if there are no other questions.
Seeing none, thank you so much, Mr. Carpenter, and all of your team. Thank you, everyone. We're going to let you get back to your seat because you're on the hot seat again. So we're moving on to 4.2, the CEO report. We'll give Matt a second to get himself together.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. A number of sort of routine updates here. We are looking forward to welcoming our new Deputy CEO of Operations, Mr. George Brooks. It's getting closer, February 13th. We're excited. We also celebrate the retirement of Mary Boonen, our Manager of Community Relations, after 23 years. We wish her all the best. And the second page of this, you will see a written version of the long-range plan status report. So it may come in this format. Sometimes it'll come with the team, like you saw. Sometimes it'll just come like this. The only thing we didn't talk about, the Blake Transit Center expansion continues to move forward. That's in the long-range plan as well. The Washtenaw Avenue planning study is an interesting one. Mike had asked me about this a week or two ago. MDOT is coming forward with what they call a Pell study, and they're linking it very tightly to the Reimagine Washtenaw project. Some of you may remember from 6-7 years ago. It's a chance to reboot that thinking, but we are working directly with MDOT about sort of moving a lot of our priorities, like bus lanes, like BRT, pre-BRT stuff, into their study scope. But they're a road agency, so we're only going to get so much out of that. But it's a good opportunity that we're tagging onto. And I think those are the only things we didn't talk about in the broader update. And other than that, happy to answer any questions.
I do have a question about the Washtenaw Avenue planning study. So as I'm reading this, the study is actually just going to be from Ypsilanti to US 23 and not beyond. Is that correct? Because I'm interpreting that saying it says the Ann Arbor border, and I'm assuming that 23 is the border.
Yes.
Okay.
Roughly.
All right. Thank you.
This is an interesting when the bipartisan infrastructure bill was being discussed, so 2021, MDOT was pushing hard to get money to repave Washtenaw Avenue from Ypsilanti to the Ann Arbor border. It was strictly a repavement. They're just fixing the road. That was the first thing we heard about it, and they were kind of pushing that real hard. They didn't get it. So this, I think, is an opportunity for them to step back and work with the broader community, because they heard a lot that people wanted bike lanes, people wanted filling in the sidewalk gaps. There's a lot of things on Washtenaw that people have been waiting for a long time, and the original MDOT proposal was just to rip off the asphalt and put down new asphalt and maybe curbs. So this is an opportunity for them to step back, get maybe a slightly more expansive project closer to shovel ready, so that if another big pot of money becomes available, they've got a plan ready to jump on it. So I commend them for taking a step back and involving all the communities. We're just one of the agencies at the table.
Thank you for that. Do we have any questions or comments for Mr. Carpenter on the CEO report? Seeing none, we'll close that item of business and we'll move on to number 5, emergent items. Do we have any emergent items? I see Mr. Hunter has his hand raised.
Well, good evening, everybody.
Good evening, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you for recognizing me. I've been kind of thinking about this part of tonight for the time we've been here. And I should share with you now, unless you, in case you didn't know, that a unique situation has arisen in Ypsilanti Township, and there was an opening on their Board of Trustees to which they were taking open applications, and I applied, and thankfully I was chosen. So effective now, well, actually I haven't quite been sworn in yet, but I plan to be. I will be sitting on the Ypsilanti Township Board of Trustees. But while I hoped there would be an opportunity for me to serve here, to continue serving here and in Ypsi Township, that is not to be due to a arcane policy. So unfortunately, I must say that tonight will be my last sitting with you as a fellow member here. I just want to thank everyone here for nearly 4 years of everything. I mean, we've gone through it all, from obviously a pandemic to millages to picking out new paint schemes for our buses. I mean, we've done some of everything, and I came here really with the mind to maintain services, to maintain costs, and to just improve what we do offer. So we've, I think, been successful in just about all of that in one form or fashion. And that's really due to all of your dedications and the leadership. So I want to thank Matt, of course. You are a fantastic CEO and a tremendous leader. And I appreciate your mentorship and patience with me over my period here with you all. And of course, I want to recognize our former chair, Eric, who was every bit a tremendous leader. So, and Kathleen, you are stepping into the role wonderfully. So I know that with your leadership, we are all in good hands, and I expect that we will continue to do great things. So, and you all, to each of you, I'm sitting in a room with it feels like PhD level folks with your dedication. And Jesse, I mean, you knock it out every time. So I mean, just you open my mind to so many different things. So I want to just thank you. I've learned from you. Believe it or not. So, yeah, and I just wish you all well in the future. And of course, this is just an evolution of our relationship. I plan to engage and interact with you wherever possible, and just know that you all are in my mind. So you have a friend in the township, and thank you for allowing me to serve.
Well, Ryan, I think I echo everyone, their thoughts that congratulations for this awesome opportunity that's been presented to you. We will miss you. We will miss your input and your guidance and your just your dedication to making things better for AATA as a whole, but also your dedication to your community, and that you're being recognized for that by being appointed as you have been to the township. Kudos to you again. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, can we top that? Is there any other emergent business? None seeing any. We will move on to our action item recap. Mr. Carpenter?
Sure, a quick rundown. I encourage everyone to look at the Bus World Conference in Detroit, make your own decisions. Annual plan of work has been approved, so we're going to start working with the governance committee about how to implement that. Task force updates. Remind me, Rich, what's your next step? The letter, yes. And the monitoring task force, you approved some new tools this evening, so they're going to be implemented. The next time you see any of this stuff, we'll be using that, and I'll be looking to Deb and to Rosa to make sure that that goes in. I believe you, by consensus, are also going to start using the tracking tool, and Jesse's volunteered to fully step into his secretarial roles, although we're going to talk more at governance committee about exactly what that looks like. Okay. 2.9, Rose is going to work with Jesse and that group and the service committee to come up with a clear proposal, bring it back next month. They have the information, it's just writing it down. The 2.0 report was accepted under extreme duress, and great discussion, but we're moving forward there. I'll come back to you in a year with a knock it out of the park interpretation. Ends monitoring report introduced. You'll get the survey starting tomorrow. You don't have to fill it out tomorrow. Please track your time. I think if nothing else, we sort of keep in mind how long it took you to fill it out, and we'll go from there. And stay tuned for more great stuff about the long-range plan. We'll have projects and updates as we go. Did I miss anything, Deb? I didn't.
I don't think so. That was pretty comprehensive. So then that leads into 6.2 topics for our next meeting. We will hear the quarterly one service report, the quarterly one financial report, a ZEB propulsion recommendation, 2.5 financial conditions, our ends monitoring report, and 4.0 to 4.4 board management delegation policies. I'm also wondering, Matt, I was reviewing our December meeting minutes and wondering when we're going to hear about the final FDA report. Dina had mentioned that it was in transition and they were there would be a final report.
Yeah, I'll check with her. She's ill, unfortunately, this week. She's actually watching, or at least she was earlier, but sort of hanging back. I remember seeing the emails come in. I will double check with her and we'll tie that off.
Okay, sounds good. As a reminder, just to let the public know, the next meeting is Thursday, February 16th, 2023. If you'd like to attend in person, and for our board members here, we will not be on the fourth floor due to a scheduling conflict. So we will be in the lower level conference room, which is in, I believe, the basement level. And that, again, that meeting starts at 6:30 p.m. And now, go ahead, Jesse.
I wanted to, we should also include 2.9, hopefully as a decision item to,
yes.
For next meeting. And were we expecting from the finance committee any discussion of that other policy that they're working on?
Construction.
Yeah, because the construction policy.
Mike, do you think in, at our next board meeting, we'll be discussing any recommendations from the finance committee with regards to the construction policy, or are you going to need some more time? Or maybe
it's a little hard to say because we really haven't gotten into it yet, so I'm guessing not. But I'm also looking at the list of topics for the next meeting, and all I can say is, wow. Oh my God.
It's going to be a long one, folks. All righty.
So let's just say, for that reason, and really, I don't think it can say now whether we'll have anything. So I think
Okay.
no.
And we can discuss that more in governance
Yeah.
at the next meeting as well. All righty then. So my dog's already snoring. 6.3 public comment. Deb, do we have anyone?
We do. Robert Pulowski, and you are unmuted.
Good evening, and thank you for the time and opportunity to speak again. So like I said in the beginning, and first off, I'd like to say from the departure tonight from board member Ryan Hunter, thank you for your service. We really appreciate what you've done. And, you know, all the amazing work you guys have done at board members, especially you in particular. You have done a lot more in your service, following up with Kathleen. So I appreciate everything you've done and wish you luck at the IPSI Board of Trustees and going forward to shaping the region. Also, really to touch on, you know, what we've seen for the 2045 plan. I'm happy to see the IPSI Transit Center get that increased funding. Thank you, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, for getting that funding out, because now we finally get to see IPSI go on the rise and finally see an increase in public transit. But more so, if we talk about this, it really benefits down to where can we see an increase in economic development in IPSI. And that's one of the things I'm going to be very excited for in the coming years once this gets finally grand opening going forth. And really the bus rapid transit study in terms of, you know, IPSI to US 23, long overdue. We needed that for a long time. I mean, we went a long time on Woodward, Gratiot, Michigan without a bus rapid transit. Look where we're at now. We finally have an express service. And now we're finally starting to see some changes here in Washtenaw County, which I think is kind of sad to see it, because I would anticipate they would have done this sooner, but hey, now we finally have it. But one of the things, the expanded service into Ypsi Township, you know, everything that was promised during this plan, once we put this on the ballot for the millage to go forth, was, I think, the big draw for a lot of folks, especially out of county residents, was the expanded service into Western Wayne County. Currently, I'm having ongoing conversations with County Commissioner Melissa Daub, County Commissioner of the Oakland County Board of Commissioners, District 15, Gwen Markham, Abdul Haddis, District 11 of Wayne County, no stranger to transit, and also Terry Marecki of Livonia for the Wayne County Commission to really get their thoughts on this. I encourage staff to really, when we get towards this process, to really continue this conversation, because especially with Wayne County, it's an ongoing battle with countywide transit. You know, I think you'll have the full support in terms of Ann Arbor, but you know, that's something that really needs to go in front of county commission if we really want to see expanded transit, because this is not just going to be something to get into Washtenaw. This is going to be connecting out of county residents, and, you know, a lot of cities and counties, they're going to really have a say, and commissioners are really going to be interested in what you're going to be proposing once this goes forth. And, you know, I look forward to the best. And like I said in my first public comment, we have a lot of work to do, and 2023 is going to be the year to get it done. But you know, it's going to take a lot of overstepping with county commission, the cities. Washtenaw County, you have the full support, but it really boils down to you really need to gain the trust of Wayne County, because I don't think they see the full picture. And I think there needs to be a selling point once we take this in front. And lastly, thank you for the reminder, Matt. I already have my tickets for Bus World, so hopefully to see some board members there in February. But as always, thank you. And I look forward to speaking with you guys next month. Take care.
Do we have any other comments, Deb?
There are no more with public comment.
All right, we're going to close that section of public comment 6.3 and move on to adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Ryan? Seconded by Jesse. All in favor, raise your hands and say aye. Aye. Awesome. Good meeting, everyone.